Sometimes, the most unexpected rescues happen when you're not looking for them. In the quiet woods of the Pacific Northwest, a golden retriever named Scout discovers more than just an injured pilot beside his crashed plane. She finds a man whose dreams have been grounded by failure, just as her owner, Marie, has been grounded by grief. Jack Barnes was once a celebrated airshow performer, but now he's just another broken soul trying to find his way back to the sky. What Scout doesn't know is that her simple act of loyalty is about to change 3 lives forever, including that of 9-year-old Lily, who dreams of nothing but flying. But can a washed-up pilot really teach a little girl to soar when he's forgotten how to lift himself off the ground? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The storm arrived without warning on that October evening, the kind that reminds you how small you are against the forces of nature. Marie Donovan stood at her kitchen window, watching the wind whip the dark waters of Cider Lake into angry whitecaps. The old Douglas firs surrounding her property swayed and groaned like ancient dancers struggling to keep their rhythm. She'd lived in this lakeside cottage for 37 years, through storms that had taken down power lines and flooding that had crept up to her porch steps. But something about this one felt different, urgent, and restless, like it carried messages she wasn't meant to hear. Scout, her golden retriever, paced anxiously by the back door, his usually calm demeanor replaced by an agitation that matched the weather. His collar tags, worn smooth by years of faithful service, clinked softly as he moved, a sound that had become as familiar to Marie as her own heartbeat. The tags bore his name and her phone number, but also something more precious: the small brass medallion her late husband Tom had engraved with the words, "Faithful friend," when they brought Scout home as a puppy 6 years ago. "Easy boy," Marie murmured, running her fingers through Scout's thick coat. At 63, she'd learned to read the subtle languages of worry, and people and animals and the very air itself. Her years as a registered nurse had taught her that anxiety often preceded something significant, though she'd never expected to apply that knowledge to her dog's behavior. The retirement she'd envisioned with Tom had been filled with travel plans and lazy mornings, not the quiet solitude that now defined her days. 3 years had passed since his sudden heart attack, and though she'd grown comfortable with her own company, she sometimes caught herself setting 2 coffee cups out of habit, or turning to share an observation with someone who was no longer there. Scout's restlessness intensified as thunder rolled across the lake. He whined and scratched at the door, his brown eyes fixed on the storm-darkened woods that stretched behind her property. Marie had seen him like this only once before, the night Tom had his heart attack. Scout had paced and whimpered for hours, before Tom even felt the first chest pain. "What is it, Scout?" she asked, though she knew he couldn't answer in words. Sometimes the most important communications happened without language. Against her better judgment and the weather warnings that had been scrolling across her television screen all evening, Marie pulled on her rain jacket and boots. Scout was already at the door, tail wagging with urgent purpose. She clipped his leash to his collar, though she suspected it would be more for her security than his control. The moment they stepped outside, Scout pulled toward the tree line with a determination that surprised her. The rain hit her face like cold needles, and the wind tried to push her back toward the safety of her cottage. But Scout pressed forward, following some invisible trail that only his senses could detect. They hadn't walked more than 100 yards into the woods when Scout suddenly broke free from his leash, his powerful body disappearing into the underbrush faster than Marie could follow. She called his name, but her voice was swallowed by the storm. Panic rose in her chest, not just for Scout's safety, but for the prospect of losing the last living connection to her life with Tom. Guided by the intermittent sound of Scout's barking, Marie pushed deeper into the woods than she'd ever ventured. Alone, Branches caught at her jacket, and muddy leaves made every step treacherous. Just when she began to fear she'd lost Scout entirely, she emerged into a small clearing where the storm had done its worst. A small aircraft, what looked like. A bush plane lay crumpled among the trees like a broken bird. One wing was twisted upward at an impossible angle, and the propeller was buried in the soft earth. Scout sat beside the wreckage, his barking now reduced to anxious whimpers as he nuzzled something beside the plane's open door. Marie's nursing instincts kicked in immediately. The something Scout was attending to was a man, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound. Even in the dim light filtered through storm clouds, she could see he was breathing, though his pulse was weak when she checked his wrist. He appeared to be in his late 50s, with graying hair and weathered hands that spoke of a life spent working with them. A pair of aviator sunglasses hung crookedly from his jacket pocket, one lens cracked but somehow still clinging to the frame. She pulled out her cell phone, grateful for the single bar of service, and called 911. While she waited for help to arrive, she used her jacket to shield the unconscious pilot from the worst of the rain and spoke to him in the calm, professional voice she'd used with countless patients over her 35-year career. "You're going to be all right," she told him, though she wasn't certain it was true. "Help is coming. Just stay with us." Scout remained beside the man like a faithful sentinel, occasionally licking his hand as if trying to will him back to consciousness. Marie found herself moved by her dog's obvious concern for this stranger. In all their years together, she'd never seen Scout show such immediate attachment to anyone except family. The paramedics arrived with impressive speed, considering the storm and the remote location. They stabilized the pilot, checking his vitals, immobilizing his neck. Starting in 4 while Marie provided what information she could about how they'd found him. The lead paramedic, a young woman named Kelly, whom Marie recognized from the local hospital, worked with efficient compassion. "Any idea who he is?" Kelly asked, carefully examining the pilot's identification. "Jack Barnes," Marie read from his wallet. "Looks like he's from Portland." They searched through his belongings for emergency contact information, but found nothing. No family photos, no business cards with personal notes, no evidence of anyone waiting for him to come home. His phone had been damaged in the crash, its screen spiderwebbed beyond use. "We'll transport him to regional medical," Kelly said, "but the storm's knocked out some phone lines. Might be a while before we can track down any family." As they loaded Jack Barnes onto a stretcher, Marie made a decision that surprised even her. "If you can't find anyone," she heard herself say, "he can recover at my place. I'm a retired nurse. I have the space and the experience." Kelly looked at her with professional concern. "Marie, that's very generous, but he's a complete stranger." "Sometimes strangers are just family we haven't met yet," Marie replied, a phrase Tom used to use when he encountered people who needed help. She looked down at Scout, who had positioned himself as close to the stretcher as the paramedics would allow. Besides, Scout seems to think he's worth the trouble. 3 days later, Jack Barnes lay in Marie's guest bedroom, drifting in and out of consciousness while she monitored his recovery. The doctor had diagnosed a concussion and several cracked ribs, but no internal bleeding or life-threatening injuries. He'd been lucky, a phrase that seemed ironic, given that he'd crashed an airplane in the storm. Marie had prepared the room with the same attention she'd given to hospital patients, ensuring he had everything he might need for a comfortable recovery. Fresh linens, adequate lighting, a water pitcher and glass within easy reach. Scout had claimed a spot on the rug beside the bed, refusing to leave except for necessary trips outside. When Jack finally opened his eyes on that 3rd morning, Marie was changing the bandage on his forehead. He startled at her touch, his body tensing as if preparing to flee. "Easy," she said, using the same tone she'd used to calm Scout during thunderstorms. "You're safe. You've been unconscious for 3 days. Jack's eyes, she could see now they were blue, The color of lake water on a clear day darted around the unfamiliar room before settling on her face. "Where am I?" His voice was rough with disuse. "My guest room," Marie said simply. "You crashed your plane in the woods behind my property. My dog found you." As if summoned by the mention of his heroics, Scout rose from his spot on the rug and approached the bed cautiously. Jack's expression softened as the golden retriever rested his chin on the mattress, brown eyes full of gentle concern. "Hello, boy," Jack said, reaching out to pet Scout's head. His movements were careful, testing the limits of his injuries. "I guess I owe you one." "You owe him considerably more than one," Marie said with a slight smile. "Scout led me through a storm to find you. I'm Marie Donovan, by the way. And you're Jack Barnes, according to your identification." Jack nodded slowly, then winced at the movement. "Thank you for everything. I should probably get out of your way as soon as possible. The doctor wants you to rest for at least a week before you even think about traveling," Marie said firmly. "Besides, your plane isn't going anywhere soon." The storm did quite a number on it. For the first time, something like vulnerability crossed Jack's features. "I don't have anyone to call," he said quietly. "No family waiting to hear from me." Marie recognized the particular loneliness in his words, not the temporary solitude of being away from loved ones, but the deeper isolation of having no one to worry about your absence. She'd felt it herself in the months after Tom's death, when she realized there was no one who would notice if she didn't come home at night. Then, "It's settled," she said. "You'll stay until you're well enough to leave properly." That afternoon, as Jack slept off the pain medication, Marie found herself preparing dinner for two for the first time in 3 years. She moved through her kitchen with renewed purpose, humming softly as she seasoned the chicken and chopped vegetables. Scout lay in his usual spot by the stove, but kept glancing toward the guest room as if checking on their unexpected house guest. The cottage felt different with another person in it. Not crowded, but fuller somehow. The silence that had become her constant companion was broken by the sounds of someone else breathing, shifting in sleep, existing in her space. It wasn't unwelcome, she realized. It was like remembering how to harmonize after years of singing solo. When the front door opened that evening, Marie looked up from her cooking to see her granddaughter Lily burst through the entrance like a small tornado. At 9 years old, Lily possessed the kind of boundless energy that could power a small city, along with an insatiable curiosity about everything that moved through air or space. "Grandma Marie," Lily called, shedding her backpack and jacket in the entryway. "Mom said you found a crashed airplane pilot. Is he really here? Can I meet him? Does he know about jets? Has he ever done barrel rolls?" Marie smiled at the rapid-fire questions. Lily visited twice a week after school, a routine that had begun after Tom's death when Marie's daughter Sarah had worried about her mother's isolation. What started as a well-meaning attempt to provide companionship had evolved into one of the brightest parts of Marie's week. "Slow down, little aviator," Marie said, using Tom's old nickname for Lily. "Yes, there's a pilot here. And yes, you can meet him when he wakes up. But remember, he's still recovering from his injuries." Lily's eyes went wide with excitement and concern. "Is he going to be okay? What kind of plane was it? Was it like the ones in my books?" Before Marie could answer, a soft voice came from the hallway. "It was a Cessna 185, Jack said, leaning against the doorframe. He'd managed to dress in the clean clothes Marie had provided, a pair of Tom's old flannel shirts and jeans that fit reasonably well. A bush plane made for landing in rough country. Lily turned toward him with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for nature documentaries about birds. "A real bush plane? Like the ones that land on water and take supplies to places that don't have airports?" Jack's expression shifted, showing the first genuine warmth Marie had seen from him. "Exactly like that. Though I wasn't supposed to be landing in rough country that night." The storm had other ideas. "Are you a bush pilot?" Lily asked, stepping closer with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Do you fly to Alaska and places like that? Have you ever seen a moose from the air?" Marie watched Jack's face carefully, noting how his initial warmth was tempered by something more complex, pride mixed with regret, fondness shadowed by loss. "I used to be a different kind of pilot," he said carefully. "I performed in air shows, doing aerobatic flying for crowds." "Aerobatic flying?" Lily's voice pitched higher with excitement. "You mean like loops and spins and flying upside down?" "Something like that," Jack said, his voice growing quieter. "Though it's been a while since I've done any real flying." Marie sensed the weight behind his words, the same kind of careful editing she'd learned to do when people asked how she was adjusting to retirement. Some parts of our stories become too heavy to share with casual conversation, especially with children whose worlds still sparkle with possibility. "Well," Marie sighed, stepping between them with practiced grace. "Right now this pilot needs to focus on getting better. Lily, why don't you help me set the table?" "Well, Lily, why don't you help me set the table? We're having an extra guest for dinner tonight." As Lily chattered excitedly about airplanes and pilots, Marie caught Jack's grateful look. She nodded slightly, understanding passing between them, the recognition of two people who had learned to protect their tender places from well-meaning curiosity. Dinner that evening was the liveliest meal Marie's kitchen had seen in years. Lily peppered Jack with questions about flying, and he answered with increasing ease, sharing stories of air currents and cloud formations, the way different aircraft handled in various weather conditions, the unique perspective of seeing the world from above. Marie listened, noting how Jack's voice grew stronger when he talked about the technical aspects of aviation, but remained carefully neutral when Lily asked about specific adventures or memorable flights. Scout stationed himself between Jack's chair and Lily's, as if appointing himself the official guardian of both the recovering pilot and the excitable child. His presence seemed to calm Jack, who occasionally reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Grandma Marie," Lily said as they cleared the dishes, "can Jack stay until he teaches me about flying? I want to learn everything." Marie saw Jack's expression tighten almost imperceptibly. Learning about flying and learning to fly are two very different things, sweetheart, Marie said gently. And Jack needs to focus on getting well first. But Lily, with the persistence of childhood and dreams of flight, had already moved on to her next question. "Jack, what's the highest you've ever flown? Have you ever gone through clouds? What does it feel like when you're upside down?" Jack looked out the window toward the darkening sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. "It feels," he said slowly, "like freedom. Like you've left all the weight of the world on the ground, and you're dancing with the wind itself." Marie saw something shift in both of their faces, Lily's with wonder at the poetry of his description, and Jack's with what looked like surprise at his own words, as if he'd forgotten that flying had ever felt like anything other than loss. Jack spent his first full week of recovery helping Marie with small tasks around the cottage, partly out of gratitude and partly to avoid the restless energy that came with forced inactivity. His ribs protested when he lifted anything heavier than a coffee cup, but his hands remembered the satisfaction of fixing things, tightening loose hinges, replacing burned-out light bulbs, adjusting the wobble in Marie's kitchen table that she'd grown accustomed to working around. Marie watched him work with the trained eye of someone who'd spent decades assessing patience. His movements were careful but determined, and she noted how he seemed most at ease when he had something constructive to do with his hands. He reminded her of Tom and that waymen of a generation who measured their worth by their usefulness, who found comfort in solving problems they could see and touch. "You don't have to earn your keep," she told him one morning as he examined the sticky window latch in the living room. "You're a guest here, not hired help. I need to do something." Jack replied, working the mechanism until it moved smoothly. Sitting still makes me think too much. Marie understood the sentiment. After Tom's death, she'd thrown herself into reorganizing closets and repainting rooms. Anything to keep her mind occupied with immediate tasks rather than the vast emptiness of a future she'd never planned to navigate alone. Lily arrived that afternoon with her usual enthusiasm, but this time she carried a worn cardboard box under her arm. She set it carefully on Marie's coffee table and began pulling out papers, dozens of folded airplanes in various states of construction, from simple dart-like designs to complex models with multiple wings and intricate folds. I made these, she announced proudly, arranging them in neat rows. Every different kind I could find in the library books. This one's supposed to be a glider, and this one's a fighter jet, and this one's a passenger plane like the big ones at the airport. Jack paused in his window repair, drawn by the display. Each plane was carefully crafted, with crisp folds and attention to detail that spoke of hours of patient work. Some bore crayon decorations, flames on the wings, passenger windows along the sides, careful lettering that spelled out airline names Lily had invented. These are remarkable, Jack said, picking up one of the more complex designs. You made all of these yourself? Lily nodded enthusiastically. I've been making them since I was 6. Mom says it's because I want to fly someday, but really I just like how they look when they're sailing through the air. Like they're free. The word hung in the air between them, the same word Jack had used to describe flying just a few nights earlier. Marie saw recognition pass across his face, followed by something that looked almost like pain. Have you ever tried flying any of them? Jack asked, his voice gentler than usual. Oh yes, Lily said. From the porch, from the deck at school, from the big hill behind our house. Some of them are really good flyers. This one, she held up a sleek design with pointed wings, can go almost to the end of our yard if the wind's right. Jack examined the plane more closely, running his fingers along the folds with professional interest. You've got the weight. Distribution exactly right, he said. And see how you've angled the wings? That's going to give you good stability in flight. Lily beamed at the praise. Do you really think so? I mean, you're a real pilot, so you would know about these things. Something shifted in Jack's expression, a tightening around his eyes that Marie had begun to recognize as his response to reminders of his aviation background. I used to be a real pilot, he said quietly. What do you mean, used to be? Lily asked with the directness of childhood. Did you forget how to fly? The question hit harder than she'd intended. Jack set the paper airplane down carefully, his movements suddenly deliberate in the way that suggested he was fighting some internal battle. No, he said. You don't forget how to fly, but sometimes you lose the right to do it. Marie felt the conversation shifting into dangerous territory, the kind of moment when someone's carefully constructed defenses threaten to crumble. She started to redirect, but Lily's next words cut through any attempt at diplomatic conversation. Why did you lose the right? Jack looked at her for a long moment. This child with her box of paper dreams and her absolute faith that adults could answer any question if they chose to. Marie saw him make a decision whether to retreat behind polite evasions or trust Lily with a piece of his story. I made a mistake, Jack said finally. A big one. People got hurt because of something I did wrong, and after that, I couldn't bring myself to fly anymore. Lily considered this with the seriousness she brought to important matters. But you can still fly, right? I mean, you still know how. Knowing how and being able to are different things, Jack said. Sometimes when you break something important, it doesn't go back to the way it was before. But you could try, Lily insisted with the relentless optimism of 9-year-old logic. Maybe it would work better than you think. Jack reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something Marie hadn't noticed before, a folded program, its edges soft with wear. He smoothed it out on the coffee table beside Lily's airplanes, revealing a colorful advertisement for the Pacific Northwest Airshow, dated 3 years earlier. The program featured a dramatic photograph of an aerobatic plane caught mid-maneuver against a brilliant blue sky, white smoke trailing from its wings in perfect spirals. At the bottom of the page, in bold letters, it read, "Featuring Jack Barnes in sky dancing. Precision aerobatics that will take your breath away." Lily's eyes went wide. "That's you? You were famous?" Jack's laugh held no humor. "For about 15 years, yes. I traveled to air shows across the country, performing aerobatic routines for crowds. It was everything I'd ever wanted to do with my life." Marie studied the photograph, seeing in it a different version of the man sitting in her living room. The pilot in the image radiated confidence and joy, someone who belonged in the sky, who found his truest self 3,000 feet above the ground. "What happened?" Lily asked, her voice smaller now, as if she sensed they were approaching something painful. Jack was quiet for so long that Marie thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one cost him something. "The last show I performed was in Spokane. Beautiful day. Perfect flying weather. I was doing my signature routine, a series of loops and barrel rolls that ended with a low pass over the crowd. I'd done it hundreds of times." He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of the program. "But that day, something went wrong. Maybe I misjudged my altitude. Maybe the wind shifted. Maybe I was just overconfident. I came out of the final loop too low and too fast." Lily leaned forward, her paper airplanes forgotten. "I had to pull up hard to avoid the grandstands," Jack continued. "The force of the maneuver caused a mechanical failure. Something in the engine mount gave way. I managed to land the plane, but barely. And when I did..." He stopped, the words seeming to stick in his throat. "What happened when you landed?" Lily asked softly. "Debris from the engine hit the crowd," Jack said. 3 people were hospitalized. A little girl about your age got hit by a piece of metal. She was okay, thank God, but she could have been killed. They all could have been killed because I was showing off, trying to give the crowd a thrill." Marie saw the weight he carried in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands curved protectively around the worn program, as if he could somehow shield the memory from causing more damage. "But it was an accident," Lily said. "You didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. Intention doesn't matter much when you're pulling shrapnel out of someone's arm," Jack replied. "I was supposed to be a professional. People trusted me to keep them safe, and I failed them." Lily picked up one of her paper airplanes and turned it over in her hands, studying its simple construction as if seeing it for the first time. "Is that why you don't fly anymore?" "That's why I can't fly anymore," Jack corrected. "Every time I think about getting back in a cockpit, I see that little girl's face. I hear the sound the crowd made when they realized what was happening. I feel the plane bucking under my hands, knowing I'd lost control of something that could kill people." Marie recognized the particular torture of a caregiver who had caused harm instead of healing, the way guilt could poison every memory of past success, making you question not just what you'd done wrong, but whether you'd ever truly been competent at all. "Maybe," Lily said carefully, "the people who got hurt wouldn't want you to stop flying forever because of one bad day." Jack looked at her with something approaching surprise. "What makes you think that?" "Because," Lily said, arranging her paper airplanes in a neat squadron, "if I got hurt by a pilot, I wouldn't want all the other pilots to stop flying. I'd want them to be extra careful so it wouldn't happen again, but I wouldn't want them to give up their dreams." The simple wisdom of her words seemed to catch Jack off guard. He stared at the airshow program, then at Lily's fleet of paper aircraft, As if seeing both for the first time, Marie watched this exchange with growing understanding of why Scout had been so drawn to Jack. Why her dog had insisted on leading her through a storm to find this particular broken man. Sometimes rescue wasn't about saving someone from immediate physical danger. Sometimes it was about pulling them back from the edge of permanent despair. "Jack," she said gently, "how long has it been since you've tried to fly anything? Even something small?" Jack considered the question. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, he said, the precision of his answer revealing how closely he'd been counting. Lily stood up suddenly and selected one of her most carefully constructed paper airplanes, the sleek fighter jet design that had caught Jack's attention earlier. She held it out to him with ceremonial seriousness. "Maybe you could start with something that can't hurt anyone," she said. "Something small and safe, just to remember what it feels like to make something fly." Jack took the paper airplane from her hands, his fingers automatically checking the balance and construction. For a moment, Marie saw something flicker across his face. Not quite hope, but perhaps the memory of hope. "It's been a long time since I've launched one of these," he admitted. "That's okay," Lily said. "Paper airplanes are very forgiving. Even if you mess up, no one gets hurt. You just pick it up and try again." Jack stood slowly, testing the weight of his ribs, then walked to the living room's large window. He held the paper airplane up to the light, examining Lily's handiwork with professional attention. "Good construction," he murmured. "Nice weight. Distribution. Should have excellent glide characteristics." Lily joined him at the window, bouncing slightly on her toes with excitement. "Do you think it will fly as far as the lake? From inside the house?" Jack smiled, the first genuine smile Marie had seen from him. "I think we might need to take this experiment outside." They moved to the back porch, where the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Marie's yard toward the lake. Scout followed, tail wagging with anticipation of some new activity. Jack positioned himself at the porch railing, the paper airplane held loosely in his right hand. For a long moment, he stood frozen, staring at the simple folded paper as if it were a real aircraft. Requiring pre-flight checks and careful consideration of wind conditions, Marie could see the internal struggle playing out across his features, the desire to let go warring with fear of what might happen if he allowed himself to enjoy flight again, even in this innocent form. "Remember," Lily said softly, "it's just paper. If it crashes, we'll make another one." Jack nodded, drew back his arm, and released the plane with a smooth, practiced motion. The paper aircraft caught the breeze and soared across the yard in a long, graceful arc, banking slightly to the left before touching down gently near the water's edge. "Perfect flight!" Lily shouted, clapping her hands. "You got it almost to the lake." Marie watched Jack's face as he stared at the distant paper airplane. For just a moment, his expression held something she hadn't seen before, not quite joy, but a kind of surprised recognition, as if he'd rediscovered a part of himself he'd thought was permanently lost. Scout trotted down to the water's edge and carefully picked up the paper airplane in his mouth, carrying it back to the porch like a faithful retriever returning a downed bird. Jack accepted the slightly damp aircraft from Scout's gentle grip, smoothing out the dampened wings. "Want to try again?" Lily asked hopefully. Jack looked at the repaired airplane, then at Lily's eager face, then at Marie, who nodded encouragingly from her spot in the porch chair. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think I'd like to try again." The morning after Jack's first paper airplane flight, Marie found him on their back porch at sunrise, coffee mug in hand, staring across the lake with an expression she couldn't quite read. Scout lay beside his chair, content in the way dogs become when they sense their humans are finding peace. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves, and the lake stretched before them like polished glass, unmarked by wind or boats. "You're up early," Marie observed, settling into the chair beside him with her own coffee. "Couldn't sleep," Jack admitted. "Not because of nightmares this time, just thinking." Marie had learned not to press when people needed to process difficult emotions at their own pace. Her nursing certificate hung in her bedroom now, dusty from 3 years of retirement, but the skills it represented: patience, observation, the ability to provide comfort without overwhelming, remained as sharp as ever. "Penny for your thoughts?" She offered gently. Jack gestured toward the lake, where the first light was beginning to paint the water in shades of gold and rose. I'd forgotten how much I love mornings like this. When I was performing, I was always rushing to the next show, the next hotel, the next crowd. I never took time to just be still. "Retirement taught me the value of stillness," Marie said. "Though I'll admit, some days the quiet can feel too big." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who understood that sometimes the most important conversations happened in the spaces between words. Scout stretched and wandered down to the water's edge, his golden coat catching the early light as he investigated the scents left by nocturnal lake visitors. "Marie," Jack said eventually, "why did you really take me in? I mean, you don't know anything about me. I could be dangerous." Marie considered the question seriously. "Scout trusted you immediately," she said. "In all the years I've had him, I've never seen him respond to a stranger the way he did to you. Dogs have instincts about character that we've trained ourselves out of. And that was enough? That, and the fact that you fixed my kitchen table without being asked. Men who take pleasure in solving small problems rarely create big ones." She paused, watching Scout chase a water bird that took flight just beyond his reach. "Besides, I recognized something in you that first night. The way you held yourself, like you were carrying more weight than any one person should bear alone." Jack's hands tightened around his coffee mug. "You lost someone recently, didn't you?" "My husband Tom, 3 years ago." The words came easier now than they had in the beginning, though the ache remained. "Heart attack." No warning, no time to prepare. One day we were planning a trip to Scotland. The next day I was planning a funeral. "I'm sorry. Thank you." The thing about sudden loss is that it teaches you how quickly everything can change, how precious ordinary moments are. She gestured toward the peaceful lake scene before them. "This morning, for instance. Yesterday, I was having coffee alone. Today, I'm sharing it with a friend. You never know what gifts a day might bring." Jack looked at her with something approaching gratitude. "I haven't had many friends these past few years. I've been living in Portland, but not really living, if that makes sense. Just existing, going through motions." "What were you doing for work?" "Odd jobs, mostly. Mechanical repair, some construction. Nothing that required me to be responsible for anyone's safety but my own." He set down his coffee mug and ran his hands through his hair. "I was flying too. Seattle when the storm hit. Had a job interview at a charter service, cargo flights, mail delivery. Nothing glamorous, but honest work." Marie understood the careful boundaries he'd drawn around his life, the way he'd chosen occupations that couldn't echo the catastrophic failure that had ended his flying career. "Will you reschedule the interview?" "I don't know. Maybe this was a sign that I'm not ready to get back in the air, even for cargo runs." Before Marie could respond, Lily's voice carried across the yard from the front of the house. She appeared around the corner at a run, backpack bouncing against her shoulders, clearly having come straight from the school bus stop. "Jack, Marie," she called. "I brought something to show you." She climbed the porch steps 2 at a time and pulled a library book from her backpack, a thick volume about aviation history, its cover featuring vintage photographs of early aircraft and their pilots. "I checked this out yesterday," Lily announced, settling cross-legged on the porch floor between their chairs. Look at all the different kinds of planes people have invented. Some of them are so weird looking, but they all figured out how to fly. She opened the book to a page featuring the Wright brothers' first successful flight. The famous photograph of Orville prone on the lower wing while Wilbur ran alongside. Can you imagine being the first person to ever do something? Like, nobody in the whole history of the world had ever flown before. And then one day, these two guys just decided to try? Jack leaned forward to look at the book, his interest genuine. They weren't the first to try, he said. Lots of people had tried before them. What made the Wrights different was that they understood the problem scientifically. They didn't just strap wings on and hope for the best. They studied birds. They tested different wing shapes. They figured out how to control their machine in the air. Is that what you had to do? Learn all the science before you could fly? Jack nodded, settling back in his chair as memories of flight training surfaced. Years of it. Weather patterns, aerodynamics, navigation, engine mechanics. You have to understand how everything works together before you can be trusted with an aircraft. But the science part is just the beginning, right? Lily flipped through pages of the book, stopping at photographs of barnstorming pilots from the 1920s. These guys look like they're having fun, not just following rules. Marie watched Jack's expression soften as he looked at the old photographs. Those pilots were artists as much as aviators, he said. They understood that flying wasn't just about getting from one place to another. It was about dancing with physics, finding harmony between human intention and natural forces. Lily's eyes lit up. Is that what aerobatic flying is? Like dancing in the sky? Something like that. Jack accepted the book from her hands and turned to a section about airshow performers. Dude, aerobatic flying looks effortless from the ground, but it requires absolute precision. Every movement has to be calculated, controlled. There's no room for improvisation when you're pulling 6 Gs in a vertical climb. 6 Gs? 6 times the normal force of gravity, Marie explained, drawing on her medical knowledge. It means your body feels 6 times heavier than normal. Most people would pass out. Jack smiled at the explanation. That's why aerobatic pilots train so hard. Your body has to be conditioned to handle forces that would overwhelm most people. But when you get it right, when you execute a perfect sequence of maneuvers. He paused, lost in the memory. There's nothing else like it in the world. Lily closed the book and looked at him seriously. Do you miss it? The aerobatic flying, I mean. The question hung in the air between them. Marie could see Jack struggling with how much truth to share with a 9-year-old who still believed that dreams were achievable simply through wanting them badly enough. Yes, he said finally. I miss it more than I know how to explain. But missing something and being able to do it again are different things. Why? Lily asked with characteristic directness. Jack glanced at Marie, who nodded encouragingly. Because when you're responsible for an aircraft, he said carefully, you're also responsible for everyone who might be affected by what you do with it. If you can't trust yourself to make perfect decisions every single time, you have no business being in control of something that could hurt people. Lily considered this with the gravity she brought to important concepts. But nobody makes perfect decisions every single time. That's why we practice things. Some mistakes are too big to practice through, Jack replied. Marie recognized the familiar spiral of his self-condemnation and decided to redirect the conversation. Jack, she said, would you mind helping me with something today? I've been putting off cleaning out Tom's workshop, and I could use someone with mechanical experience to tell me what's worth keeping. Jack looked grateful for the change of subject. Of course, I'd be happy to help. Lily perked up immediately. Can I help too? I love looking through old tool collections. Marie smiled at her granddaughter's enthusiasm. I think that would be perfect. Tom always said the best way to understand how things work is to handle the tools that built them. They spent the afternoon in Tom's workshop, a converted garage, space that had served as his retreat for woodworking and small engine repair. Marie had avoided the space since his death, overwhelmed by the prospect of sorting through a lifetime's accumulation of tools, hardware, and half-finished projects. Jack moved through the workshop with the appreciation of someone who understood quality craftsmanship. He examined Tom's hand tools, chisels sharp enough to shave paper, levels that had stayed true through decades of use, measuring squares worn smooth by countless projects. "Your husband was a serious craftsman," Jack observed, running his fingers along the blade of a hand plane. "These tools are museum quality." "He learned from his father, who learned from his," Marie said. "3 generations of cabinet makers." Tom was the first to treat it as a hobby instead of a profession. Lily discovered a collection of wooden toy airplanes on a high-shelf models Tom had carved for her when she first became fascinated with flight. She handled them with reverent care, marveling at the detail work that had gone into each miniature aircraft. "Grandpa Tom made these just for me," she told Jack proudly. "He said every pilot needed a fleet to practice with before they got their real wings." Jack examined one of the carved planes, a perfect replica of a World War II fighter, complete with movable control surfaces and retractable landing gear. "This is incredible workmanship. Look at how he's captured the proportions, the way the wing meets the fuselage." He spent hours on each one, Marie remembered. Said that if Lily was going to dream about flying, she should understand what real aircraft looked like. As they worked, sorting tools into piles for keeping, donating, or discarding, Jack began sharing stories of his own mechanical education. His father had been an aircraft mechanic, and Jack had learned to love engines before he'd learned to love flying. Dad always said that pilots who understood their machines made better aviators. Jack said, cleaning grease from an old wrench. "You can't just trust the instruments. You have to listen to what the aircraft is telling you through sound, vibration, the way it responds to your inputs." "Is that how you knew something was wrong during your last performance?" Lily asked. "Did the airplane tell you?" Jack paused in his cleaning, considering how to answer. "Not exactly. The failure happened too fast for the aircraft to warn me. But if I'd been paying better attention to my altitude, my airspeed, the wind conditions, if I'd been listening instead of just performing, I might have avoided this situation entirely." Marie recognized the self-blame creeping back into his voice. "Jack," she said gently, "Tom used to say that the best craftsmen weren't the ones who never made mistakes. They were the ones who learned from their errors and became wiser." Jack looked at her with something approaching hope. "You think wisdom can overcome fear?" "I think," Marie said, watching Lily arrange Tom's carved airplane's information on the workbench, "that wisdom helps us understand the difference between reasonable caution and paralyzing terror. One keeps you safe, the other keeps you from living." Scout, who had been napping in a corner of the workshop, suddenly lifted his head and trotted to the open garage door. A moment later, they heard the sound of an approaching vehicle, a pickup truck pulling into Marie's driveway. "That'll be Frank Morrison from the salvage yard," Marie said, recognizing the engine sound. "I called him about taking a look at your airplane. See what might be salvageable." Jack's expression shifted, a mixture of anxiety and reluctant hope crossing his features. "I hadn't thought about whether it could be repaired." "Only one way to find out," Marie said. "Besides, even if it can't fly again, there might be parts worth saving. Waste not, want not, as Tom used to say." They walked outside to meet Frank, a weathered man in his 60s who'd been in the aircraft salvage business for most of his adult life. He greeted Marie with the easy familiarity of longtime acquaintance, then turned his attention to Jack. "So you're the pilot," Frank said, offering his hand. "Heard you had quite a night in the storm. Lucky to be walking away from any crash, especially in weather like that." Jack shook the offered hand. his manner cautious but respectful. "I'm grateful to be alive. Though I'm not sure what's left of the aircraft is worth much." Frank grinned. "You'd be surprised what can be rebuilt. I've seen planes that looked like scrap metal fly again with enough patience and the right parts. Want to walk out and take a look?" The four of them, plus Scout, made their way through the woods to the crash site. Marie hadn't returned since that first stormy night, and she was struck by how different the scene looked in afternoon sunlight. What had seemed like complete devastation in the darkness now revealed itself as damage that was serious, but perhaps not irreparable. Frank walked around the downed Cessna with professional interest, taking photographs and making notes on a weathered clipboard. He peered into the engine compartment, examined the twisted wing, tested the movement of control surfaces that remained intact. "Well," he said finally, "the good news is that the engine mount failure you described probably saved your life. If that hadn't happened, you might have tried to maintain altitude and stalled into the trees at full speed instead of pancaking in relatively controlled." Jack winced at the technical analysis of his near-death experience. "What's the bad news?" "Engines. Probably a total loss, and you'll need a new wing, new prop, significant work on the fuselage." Frank consulted his notes. "But the bones are good. This old girl could fly again if someone cared enough to put the work into her." Lily looked between Jack and Frank with growing excitement. "Does that mean Jack could fix his airplane?" "Theoretically," Frank said. "Be a long-term project, though. Months of work, assuming you could find the parts and had a place to do the repairs." Marie saw something shift in Jack's posture. Not quite excitement, but perhaps the stirring of possibility. What would something like that cost? He asked quietly. Frank scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Depends on how much of the work you could do yourself. Labor's usually the biggest expense in aircraft restoration. If you've got the skills and the time, might be more affordable than you'd think." Jack nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the damaged aircraft with an expression Marie couldn't quite read. For a moment, she glimpsed the man he must have been before the accident, someone who saw challenges as puzzles to be solved rather than obstacles to be feared. "Something to think about," he said finally, as they walked back toward the house. Lily skipped ahead with Scout, her mind clearly racing with possibilities. Marie fell into step beside Jack, noting the thoughtful way he moved through the forest, as if seeing it with new eyes. "A project like that would give you a reason to stay for a while," she observed carefully. Jack glanced at her, understanding passing between them. "Are you sure you want a house guest for that long? Aircraft restoration isn't a quick process." "Jack," Marie said, stopping on the path so he would look at her directly, "this house has been too quiet for too long. Having you here, watching you, help Lily explore her dreams, seeing you remember what it feels like to love something again. It's been good for all of us, Scout included." Jack looked back toward the crash site, then ahead toward the cottage where warm light was beginning to glow in the windows as evening approached. "I haven't had a real home in 3 years," he admitted. "Just a series of rented rooms and temporary accommodations." "Well," Marie said, linking her arm through his as they continued up the path, "Scout found you for a reason. Maybe it's time to stop running from whatever brought you here and start building something instead." 2 weeks later, Jack stood in Marie's backyard holding a ball of bright yellow string while Lily carefully attached the tail to what would become the most ambitious kite either of them had ever attempted. The design had evolved over several afternoon sessions, progressing from simple diamond shapes to this elaborate box kite with multiple surfaces and a complex bridle system that Jack had calculated to provide maximum stability in variable winds. "Are you sure this is going to work?" Lily asked, stepping back to examine their creation. The kite was nearly as tall as she was, constructed from ripstop nylon that Marie had donated from an old camping tent. with wooden dowels forming a lightweight but sturdy frame. "In theory," Jack said, testing the tension of the flying lines, "the kites, like aircraft, have a way of teaching you humility. Sometimes the theory and the practice don't align perfectly." Marie watched from her porch chair, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands as she observed the easy partnership that had developed between Jack and her granddaughter. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd seen Jack change in subtle but significant ways. His movements had become less guarded, his conversation more spontaneous. The careful editing he'd applied to every word was giving way to something that resembled natural speech. Scout lay beside Marie's chair, his attention fixed on the kite preparation with the intense focus he usually reserved for wildlife observation. Marie had noticed that her dog seemed to understand the importance of these flying sessions. He never chased the kites or interfered with the launches, but positioned himself as a silent guardian of the proceedings. "The wind's picking up from the southwest," Jack observed, holding up a hand to test the air currents. "That should give us good lift off the lake." Lily picked up the kite's control handles, another innovation Jack had suggested, borrowed from his knowledge of professional kite flying. "Remember what you taught me about reading the wind?" "Tell me," Jack said, testing her knowledge in the gentle way he'd developed for all his informal flying lessons. "Watch the water surface for ripples. Feel the air temperature changes. Listen for shifts in the sound the wind makes through the trees." Lily recited the lessons with serious concentration. "And always know which direction is upwind so you know which way to run if the kite starts to fall." "Exactly right," Jack said with genuine pride. "You're becoming a real aviator, Lily. Understanding air currents is the foundation of all flight." They moved to the optimal launch position, a clear area of Marie's backyard that offered an unobstructed path to the lake. Jack held the kite overhead, while Lily positioned herself with the string, ready to provide the initial running energy that would get their creation airborne. "Ready?" Jack called. "Ready." Lily responded, her voice tight with excitement and concentration. Jack released the kite into a gust of wind, and Lily began running across the yard, feeding out line as their creation climbed steadily into the afternoon sky. For a moment, it seemed like they had achieved perfect flight, the kite stable and climbing, the lines taut but not straining. Then a crosswind caught the kite's complex surfaces, and their careful creation began to spin and dive toward the lake. "Pull. Left," Jack called, running alongside Lily. "Try to get it back into stable air." Lily adjusted her grip and pulled on the left control line, her face set with determination. The kite responded, leveling out momentarily before catching another gust that sent it soaring even higher than before. "It's working," Lily shouted, her voice carrying pure joy. "Jack, look how high it's going." Marie rose from her chair to get a better view of their success. The kite hung in the sky like a bright geometric bird, its multiple surfaces catching the sunlight and casting dancing shadows on the ground below. But more beautiful than the kite itself was the expression on Jack's face as he watched their creation fly. For the first time since she'd known him, Jack looked genuinely happy. Not just pleased or satisfied, but filled with the uncomplicated joy that comes from sharing a perfect moment with someone who understands its significance. "How does it feel?" Jack asked Lily, who was now controlling the kite with growing confidence. "Like I'm connected to the sky," she said, her eyes never leaving their flying creation. "Like I can feel what the wind is doing up there through the string." Jack nodded with deep understanding. "That's exactly what flying is, becoming connected to forces bigger than yourself, learning to work with them instead of fighting them." Marie watched this exchange with growing recognition of what was happening between Jack and Lily. Her granddaughter had always been fascinated by flight, but under Jack's patient guidance, that fascination was deepening into something approaching genuine understanding. And Jack, in teaching Lily to read the wind and understand the principles of flight, was rediscovering his own love for aviation in its purest form. "Jack," Lily said as she continued to manage the kite's flight, "when you were performing in air shows, did you feel connected to the sky like this?" The question brought Jack's moment of joy up short. Marie saw the familiar tension return to his shoulders as he was reminded of the context that had led him away from professional flying. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "when everything was working perfectly, when I was completely focused on the flying instead of the performance. Yes, it felt like this, but not always." Jack was quiet for a moment, watching the kite dance in the upper air currents. "Toward the end, I think I started flying, more for the crowd than for the joy of it. I got caught up in being impressive instead of being authentic." Lily processed this with the seriousness she brought to important concepts. "Is that what went wrong? You forgot why you love flying." Marie held her breath, recognizing this as the kind of moment that could either deepen Jack's healing or send him retreating back into protective silence. Jack seemed to sense the weight of the question, the way Lily was offering him an opportunity to examine his past with the clarity that children sometimes bring to complex adult problems. "Maybe," Jack said slowly, "I think I started believing that my worth as a pilot was measured by how amazed the crowds were, how close I could come to the edge of disaster without crossing it. I forgot that the real magic of flight is quieter, than that, more like what we're doing right now." Lily nodded, as if this made perfect sense to her. "So maybe if you flew again, you could remember the quiet magic part and forget about being impressive." The suggestion hung in the air between them like their kite visible, present, requiring some kind of response. Marie could see Jack wrestling with the possibility Lily had presented so simply, the idea that redemption might be found, not through grand gestures, but through returning to the fundamental joy that had drawn him to aviation in the first place. "It's not that simple," Jack said finally. "When you've broken something important, you can't just decide to fix it by thinking differently about it." "But you haven't broken flying," Lily pointed out with 9-year-old logic. "Flying still works. Fine. The wind still lifts things up. Planes still know how to stay in the air. You've just forgotten how to trust yourself to do it safely." Marie was struck by the wisdom in her granddaughter's assessment. In her nursing career, she'd seen many patients struggle to recover, not just from physical injuries, but from the psychological trauma of having their bodies fail them. The fear of re-injury often proved more debilitating than the original damage. "Lily," Marie called from the porch, "bring the kite down for a minute. I want to show Jack something." Lily skillfully maneuvered their creation to a gentle landing, then helped Jack wind up the flying lines while Marie disappeared into the house. She returned carrying a small wooden box that Jack hadn't seen before. "Tom made this for me after I retired," Marie said, opening the box to reveal her nursing certificate, carefully preserved between sheets of tissue paper, along with several commendation letters and a small collection of pins she'd earned for various professional achievements. Jack examined the documents with respectful attention. "You had an impressive career." 35 years, Marie said. "I delivered babies, comforted dying patients, saved lives, lost some I couldn't save. I was good at what I did, and I found meaning in it." "What made you retire?" Marie was quiet. For a moment, remembering decisions that had seemed clear at the time, but felt more complicated in retrospect. "Fear, mostly. I'd reached an age where my reflexes weren't quite as sharp. My memory occasionally failed me in small ways. I became terrified that I might make a mistake that could hurt someone." Jack looked at her with new understanding. "So you stopped practicing medicine entirely?" "I told myself I was being responsible, protecting patients from my declining abilities. But looking back, I think I was protecting myself from the possibility of failure." Marie closed the box and set it aside. "Tom used to say that I retired from nursing, but not from healing. He thought I was wasting my knowledge and experience because I was afraid of being less than perfect. Lily looked between them, clearly trying to follow the adult conversation. But Grandma Marie, you took care of Jack when he was hurt. You did nursing then. Yes, I did, Marie said with a slight smile. And I remembered how good it feels to use skills I'd spent decades developing. But I'd convinced myself that I was too old, too rusty, too likely to make a critical error. Jack understood the parallel she was drawing. How did you know it was safe to try again? I didn't, Marie admitted. But I realized that the fear of making a mistake had become bigger than my desire to help someone who needed care. And that seemed like the real failure, choosing safety over service, choosing fear over love. Jack picked up the kite and ran his fingers along its carefully constructed frame, testing joints and checking the tension of the flying lines. Marie could see him processing her words, applying them to his own situation with the methodical approach he brought to all mechanical problems. The difference, Jack said slowly, is that your mistakes might have hurt one patient at a time. My mistakes could have killed dozens of people in a single moment of poor judgment. Could, Marie emphasized, but didn't. And might not ever again if you learned from what went wrong the first time. Scout, who had been following the conversation with the attentiveness of a creature attuned to human emotional states, rose from his spot by Marie's chair and padded over to Jack. The dog sat directly in front of him and offered his paw the trick Tom had taught him years earlier as a way of asking for attention. Jack accepted the offered paw and shook it gravely. What do you think, Scout? Should an old pilot trust himself to fly again? Scout's response was to rest his head against Jack's leg with the kind of complete faith that only dogs can offer. Marie watched this simple interaction and felt something shift in the emotional atmosphere around them, a loosening of the tight control Jack maintained over his own possibilities. Maybe, Lily said, settling cross-legged on the grass beside them. You could start with something bigger than paper airplanes, but smaller than real airplanes. Like our kite, but bigger. Jack looked at her with genuine curiosity. What did you have in mind? Lily's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm that always accompanied her best ideas. What if we built a really big kite? One that could lift things up into the air? Not people, she added quickly, seeing the concern on both adults' faces. But maybe Scout's favorite tennis ball, or a camera so we could see what the world looks like from up there. Jack considered the proposal with the seriousness he brought to all of Lily's aviation questions. That would be possible, he said thoughtfully. It would require understanding load calculations, wind conditions, structural engineering. More complex than what we've been doing, but definitely achievable. Marie saw the way his voice gained energy as he considered the technical challenges involved. This was Jack at his best engaged with problems that drew on his expertise without triggering his fears. Would you help me build one? Lily asked hopefully. Jack looked at the kite they'd just flown, then at the box containing Marie's nursing certificate, then at Scout, who continued to lean against his leg with absolute trust. Yes, he said finally. I think I'd like very much to help you build something that can lift beautiful things into the sky. Jack's hand shook as he tried to thread the wire through the compass housing, the small mechanical task made impossibly difficult by the memories it triggered. The compass had belonged to his father, a simple aircraft navigation instrument that had guided countless flights before GPS made such tools seem quaint and obsolete. He'd carried it in every aircraft he'd ever flown, a talisman that connected him to the man who'd first taught him that flying was equal parts science and art. Now, the compass sat on Marie's kitchen table, its brass case tarnished and its needle pointing stubbornly northwest instead of true north, damaged, like so many other things in the crash that had ended his career. Jack had been attempting to repair it for the better part of an hour, but his usually steady hands betrayed him each time he came close to completing the delicate work. Need some help with that? Marie asked, looking up from her own project organizing Tom's woodworking plans into categories of completed Abandoned and potentially worthwhile. Jack set down the tiny screwdriver and flexed his fingers, trying to work out the tension that seemed to live permanently in his joints these days. I can't seem to get the mechanism seated properly. My hands aren't as steady as they used to be. Marie moved to the chair beside him and examined the compass with professional interest. May I? Jack nodded, grateful for the assistance. Marie's fingers, trained by decades of precise medical procedures, made quick work of aligning the internal components. Within minutes, she had the compass reassembled and functioning, its needle swinging to point true north with satisfying accuracy. Thank you, Jack said quietly. That compass has been with me for 23 years. My father gave it to me when I got my commercial license. Tell me about your father, Marie said, settling back in her chair with the patient attention she'd learned to offer when someone needed to share difficult memories. Jack turned the compass over in his hands, feeling the familiar weight of it, the way his thumb fit naturally into the worn depression on its case. He was a Navy pilot during Vietnam, then worked as an aircraft mechanic after the war. He understood machines in a way that seemed almost mystical to me as a kid. He could diagnose engine problems by sound, predict mechanical failures days before they happened. Is he the one who taught you to fly? He tried to talk me out of it, actually, Jack said with a rueful smile. He'd seen too many good pilots die in accidents that weren't their fault, mechanical failures, weather, other people's mistakes. He wanted me to be an engineer instead, design aircraft rather than risk my life flying them. Marie recognized the particular grief that came with disappointing a parent's hopes, the way love could become complicated by conflicting visions of safety and fulfillment. But you chose to fly anyway. I was 18 and certain I knew better than he did about what would make me happy, Jack said. I got my private license, then my commercial rating, then my aerobatics certification. Every step was me proving that I could handle risks he thought were unnecessary. How did he feel about your airshow career? Jack was quiet for a long moment, staring at the compass as if it might provide navigation through difficult emotional terrain. He never saw me perform professionally. He died of a heart attack 2 years before I got my first airshow contract. I used to tell myself he would have been proud, but honestly, I think he would have been terrified every time I took off. Marie understood the complex legacy of pursuing dreams that worried the people who loved you most. Tom had supported her nursing career completely, but she knew he'd lost sleep during her years working emergency medicine, knowing she dealt daily with situations that could turn dangerous without warning. Do you think his concerns were justified? She asked gently. Jack laughed, but there was no humor in it. Considering how my career ended, I'd say his fears were entirely reasonable. Maybe if I'd listened to him, if I'd chosen engineering or teaching instead of performing, 3 people wouldn't have ended up in the hospital because of my poor judgment. Before Marie could respond, Scout's sharp bark from the backyard interrupted their conversation. Through the kitchen window, they could see Lily had arrived and was apparently trying to convince Scout to help her with some elaborate construction project involving what looked like bamboo poles and colorful fabric. Looks like our kite engineer has new ideas, Marie observed. They moved to the porch to get a better view of Lily's latest creation. She had spread out on the grass what appeared to be the components for a box kite, significantly larger than anything they'd built before. The bamboo frame suggested something approaching the size of a small tent, with multiple flying surfaces and a complex bridle system that would require careful calculation to balance properly. Jack, Lily called when she spotted them. I got the materials for our lifting kite. Mom helped me order them online, and they came today. Jack descended the porch steps with growing interest, his mechanical instincts engaged by the challenge of transforming raw materials into a functional flying machine. This is ambitious, he said, examining the bamboo poles and ripstop nylon fabric Lily had arranged with military precision. "I figured out the math," Lily announced proudly, pulling a notebook from her backpack. The pages were covered with diagrams, calculations, and notes written in her careful 9-year-old handwriting. "I looked up formulas for calculating lift, capacity, and I think if we build it right, this kite could lift maybe 5 pounds. Jack took the notebook and studied her work with genuine admiration. Lily had clearly spent considerable time researching the aerodynamics of large kites, and her calculations, while simplified, showed a solid grasp of the basic principles involved. "This is impressive work, Lily," Jack said. "You've accounted for wind speed, surface area, angle of attack, all the factors that determine how much lift a kite can generate. Do you think it will work?" Lily asked hopefully. Jack ran through her calculations mentally, checking her arithmetic and assessing the feasibility of her design. "I think it has excellent potential," he said finally. "But building something this large is going to require precise construction. Every joint has to be perfect. Every angle has to be exact. That's why I need your help," Lily said. "You know how to make things that fly safely." The word safely hit Jack with unexpected force. Here was this child, trusting him to help her build something that would carry objects into the air, believing completely in his ability to create flight without causing harm. The faith in her voice was both humbling and terrifying. Marie, watching this exchange from the porch, recognized the moment of choice Jack was facing. He could deflect Lily's trust, explain why he wasn't qualified to help with projects involving flight, retreat into the safety of theoretical discussion. Or he could accept her challenge and begin the slow work of rebuilding confidence through small, manageable successes. "All right," Jack said, setting down the notebook and rolling up his sleeves. "Let's build a kite that can lift beautiful things into the sky. But we do it right. Every measurement checked twice, every joint tested before we move to the next step." Lily clapped her hands with delight. "Can we start now?" "We start by laying out all the materials and making sure we have everything we need," Jack said, falling naturally into the teaching mode that had served him well during his years as a flight instructor. Good aircraft construction begins with good planning. They spent the next hour organizing bamboo poles by length, sorting fabric pieces by color, and checking that they had adequate supplies of glue, thread, and hardware for the complex construction ahead. Jack's movements became more confident. As he worked, his hands remembering the satisfaction of precision craftsmanship, Marie watched from her chair, noting how Jack's posture changed when he was focused on technical problems. The defensive tension that characterized most of his interactions with the world seemed to dissolve when he was engaged with the concrete challenges of making something work properly. "Jack," she called during a brief pause in the construction. "Planning. What made you choose aerobatic flying instead of other types of aviation? Commercial airlines, cargo operations, flight instruction?" Jack looked up from the bamboo pole he was measuring, considering how to answer. "I love the precision of it," he said finally. "In aerobatic flying, there's no room for approximation. Every maneuver has to be executed exactly right, or the whole sequence falls apart. It was like solving three-dimensional puzzles at high speed, making split-second decisions that had to be perfect." "But that sounds incredibly stressful," Marie observed. "It was the opposite, actually," Jack said, his voice taking on the warmth that always appeared when he talked about the pure mechanics of flight. "When I was performing a routine, everything else in the world disappeared. There was just the aircraft, the air, and the sequence of moves I needed to execute. It was the most peaceful feeling I've ever experienced." Lily looked up from the fabric she was organizing. What changed? Why did it stop feeling peaceful? Jack was quiet for a moment, running his fingers along the bamboo pole he'd been measuring. I think I started caring more about the crowd's reaction than the flying itself. Instead of finding peace in the precision, I started chasing bigger thrills, more dramatic maneuvers. I lost sight of why I'd fallen in love with aerobatic flying in the first place. "Do you think you could find that peaceful feeling again?" Lily asked with the directness that always caught Jack off guard. Jack looked across Marie's yard toward the lake, where the afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows across the water. A light breeze stirred the trees, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke from distant chimneys. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'm not sure I trust myself to get back in an aircraft without making the same mistakes that led to people getting hurt." Marie recognized the familiar spiral of his self-doubt and decided to interrupt it with practical concerns. "What would it take for you to feel confident about your abilities again? Not necessarily for aerobatic performance, but just for basic flying?" Jack considered the question seriously. "Probably hundreds of hours of practice flights, working with an instructor to rebuild fundamental skills. Starting over from the beginning, like a student pilot learning to fly for the first time." "That sounds like a reasonable approach," Marie sighed. "Methodical, careful, focused on safety rather than performance. But expensive," Jack added quickly, "and time-consuming. And it would require finding an instructor willing to work with a pilot who crashed his last aircraft." Lily, who had been following this conversation with growing excitement, suddenly dropped the fabric she'd been sorting. "Wait," she said, her voice pitched high with realization. "Jack, you said your airplane could maybe be fixed, right?" "What if, while we're learning to build bigger and better kites, you were also working on repairing your plane? Like, really slowly and carefully, so you could make sure everything was perfect?" Jack stared at her, clearly caught off guard by the suggestion. "Lily, aircraft restoration is incredibly complex. It's not like building kites. People's lives depend on getting every detail exactly right. But you know how to do it, don't you?" Lily pressed. "You said you learned about engines from your father, and you've been fixing things around Grandma Marie's house. Plus, Frank Morrison said the airplane could be rebuilt if someone cared enough to do it right." Marie watched Jack's face as he processed Lily's logic, seeing him wrestle with the possibility she'd presented so matter-of-factly. The idea of rebuilding his crashed aircraft had clearly occurred to him before, but hearing it voiced by someone else, especially someone who had absolute faith in his abilities, seemed to give it new weight. "The parts alone would cost thousands of dollars," Jack said, grasping for practical objections. "And I'd need a proper workspace, specialized tools. Probably months or years to complete the project." "What about Grandpa Tom's workshop?" Lily asked immediately. "It's big enough for airplane parts, isn't it? And it has all those tools you said were museum quality." Marie felt her breath catch as she realized where Lily's suggestion was leading. Tom's workshop had sat largely unused for 3 years, accumulating dust and the particular sadness that clings to spaces where creative work once flourished. The idea of it being filled again with the sounds of purposeful construction, of becoming a place where dreams were rebuilt rather than abandoned, struck her with unexpected emotion. "That's not a bad idea," Marie said slowly. "Tom always said his workshop was meant for bringing broken things back to life. I can't think of anything he'd approve of more than using it to restore an aircraft." Jack looked between them, his expression cycling through surprise, hope, and carefully controlled fear. "I couldn't impose on your space like that. Aircraft restoration is messy, noisy work. It would take over your entire workshop." "Good," Marie said firmly. "That workshop has been too quiet for too long. Tom built it to be used, not preserved as a shrine to his memory." Scout, who had been observing this conversation from his position near the bamboo poles, suddenly stood and trotted to Jack's side. The dog sat directly in front of him and placed one paw on Jack's knee, his way of offering comfort when he sensed Emotional distress. Jack absently petted Scout's head while continuing to process the possibility that had been laid before him. Even if I could use the workshop, he said. Even if I could afford the parts. There's still the question of whether I should be working on an aircraft at all. What if I make a mistake in the restoration? What if I rebuild it incorrectly, and something fails when I try to fly it? Marie recognized the fear underlying his practical concerns, not just fear of physical failure, but fear of repeating the pattern of poor judgment that had led to his original crash. Jack, she said gently, what if the opposite is true? What if working on the restoration with complete attention to safety and precision is exactly what you need to rebuild your confidence in your own abilities? Lily nodded enthusiastically. And you wouldn't have to rush. You could take as long as you needed to make sure everything was perfect. And we could help. I could learn about airplane engines while we're building kites, and Grandma Marie could. Make sure you didn't work too hard and hurt your ribs again. Jack looked at his father's compass, still lying on the table where Marie had repaired it. The brass case gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, and the needle pointed steadily north, true direction restored through patient, careful work. It would be a big commitment, he said finally. Months of work before I'd know if the project was even feasible. What else do you have planned for the next few months? Marie asked with gentle humor. Jack's laugh had more warmth in it than she'd heard before. Good point. I was thinking of maybe finding another rented room somewhere, looking for more odd jobs that don't require anyone to trust me with anything important. That sounds boring, Lily announced with 9-year-old authority. Building kites and fixing airplanes sounds much more interesting. Marie watched Jack's face as he considered the path Lily had laid out so simply, a way forward that honored both his need for caution and his deep longing to return to the work that had once given his life meaning. She could see him beginning to believe, tentatively, that redemption might be possible through patient craftsmanship rather than dramatic gestures. If I were to consider this, Jack said carefully, I'd want to start very slowly. Maybe just having Frank Morrison bring some of the salvageable parts to the workshop, see what condition they're really in. That sounds like a perfect first step. Marie agreed. And I'd want to document everything, Jack continued, his voice gaining strength as he worked through the logistics. Photograph every step of the restoration. Keep detailed records of all parts and procedures. If I'm going to rebuild this aircraft, I want it to be the most carefully documented restoration project in history. Lily clapped her hands with delight. We can make a book about it, with pictures and explanations of everything you did. The idea seemed to catch Jack's imagination. Actually, that's not a bad thought. A detailed restoration manual could be valuable for other pilots facing similar projects. Marie saw the moment when possibility shifted from theoretical to real for Jack, the instant when his mechanical mind began engaging with the practical challenges of aircraft restoration, instead of the emotional obstacles that had seemed insurmountable. So, we have a plan, she said. Lily builds increasingly sophisticated kites while Jack works on aircraft restoration, and I supervise both projects to make sure no one gets in over their heads. What about the cost? Jack asked, still grappling with practical concerns. Marie had been thinking about this problem since Frank Morrison's assessment of the damaged aircraft. Tom left me his life insurance money. It's been sitting in the bank for 3 years because I couldn't figure out what he would have wanted me to do with it. But Tom always believed that money was meant to help people pursue their dreams, not just accumulate interest. Jack stared at her with something approaching shock. Marie, I can't accept that kind of generosity. The parts could cost $10,000 or more. Consider it a loan, Marie said firmly. You can pay me back when you're flying again and earning pilot's wages. Besides, I'll be getting something valuable in return watching that workshop come back to life, seeing Lily learn about aviation from a real expert, having both of you here to make this house feel like a home again. Scout, still positioned beside Jack's chair, gave a soft woof of what sounded like approval. Jack reached down to scratch behind Scout's ears, then looked at the compass his father had given him, then at Lily's carefully organized kite materials, then at Marie's patient, encouraging face. "All right," he said finally. "Let's see if we can build something beautiful that knows how to fly." Jack discovered the medal by accident while organizing his belongings in Marie's guest room, preparing to move some of his things to Tom's workshop, where the aircraft restoration would begin. It had been buried beneath spare clothes and mechanical manuals in his duffel bag, a small bronze medallion on a faded ribbon, tarnished from years of neglect but still bearing the inscription, Pacific Northwest Aerobatic Championship, first place, Jack Barnes, 1998. He held the medal up to the window light, remembering the young pilot who had earned it 27 years ago. That Jack Barnes had been fearless in the way that only comes from not yet understanding how much you have to lose. He'd flown that day with pure joy, executing a routine that married technical precision with artistic expression, dancing with his aircraft through maneuvers that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The medal represented everything he'd once been and everything he'd lost, not just in the crash 3 years ago, but in the gradual transformation from artist to entertainer, from someone who flew for the love of flight to someone who performed for the approval of crowds. "What's that?" Lily's voice came from the doorway, where she stood holding a cup of hot chocolate Marie had prepared for their afternoon kite-building session. Jack closed his fingers around the medal, his instinct to hide evidence of past achievements warring. With his growing trust in Lily's uncomplicated acceptance of who he was. "Something I should have thrown away a long time ago," he said. Lily stepped into the room, curiosity overcoming politeness. "Can I see?" After a moment's hesitation, Jack opened his hand to reveal the medal. Lily set down her hot chocolate and examined it with the reverent attention she brought to all aviation artifacts. "You won first place," she said, reading the inscription carefully. "That means you were the best aerobatic pilot in the whole Pacific Northwest." "That particular year, yes," Jack said. "But being the best at something doesn't mean you can't lose it. Skills fade, judgment fails, age catches up with everyone eventually." Lily turned the medal over in her small hands, studying both sides with professional interest. "What did you have to do to win this?" Despite himself, Jack found his resistance to the memory softening. "I flew a routine I'd been developing for months, a sequence of loops, rolls, and hammerhead turns that told a story. The judges were looking for technical precision, but also for artistry, for something that moved beyond just showing off." "What story did your flying tell?" Jack was quiet for a moment, surprised by how clearly he could still remember the emotional content of that long-ago routine. "It was about freedom," he said finally. "About leaving the weight of the earth behind and becoming something lighter, more graceful. About finding your place in the sky." Lily's eyes lit up with understanding. "Like what you said about dancing with the wind. Like how it feels when our kites catch the perfect breeze and sail higher than we thought they could go." "Exactly. Like that," Jack said, struck by the accuracy of her comparison. "Except I was doing it at 200 miles per hour, pulling forces that made me weigh 6 times normal, threading the needle between physics and disaster." "It sounds beautiful," Lily said softly. "And scary." "It was both," Jack admitted. "The most beautiful, terrifying thing I've ever done. When it worked, when everything came together perfectly, it felt like I was touching something sacred." Marie appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of their conversation. She took in the scene, Jack holding his old medal, Lily examining it with reverent attention, both of them surrounded by the comfortable clutter of someone making a temporary space feel like home. "I haven't seen that medal in years," Marie said, settling into the room's single chair. "Tom mentioned that you'd been a championship pilot, but I didn't realize you'd kept the hardware." Jack's expression tightened. I shouldn't have. It's a reminder of something I can't do anymore. Someone I used to be, but will never be again. Or, Murray said gently, it's evidence that you once achieved something remarkable. That the skills and artistry that won this medal are still part of who you are. Those skills nearly killed 3 people, Jack said, the familiar spiral of self-condemnation beginning to pull him down. Whatever artistry I might have had was corrupted by ego, by the need to give the crowd increasingly dangerous thrills. Lily looked up from her examination of the medal, her young face serious with the weight of adult conversation. Jack, can I ask you something about your crash? Jack tensed, but nodded. You said you came out of a loop too low and too fast, and that caused the engine problem. But had you done that same maneuver before? Like, lots of times? Hundreds of times, Jack said. It was part of my signature routine. I'd been performing variations of it for over a decade. So it wasn't that you didn't know how to do it safely. Lily continued with the relentless logic of childhood. Something else went wrong that day. Something different. Jack stared at her, realizing she was approaching the accident from an angle he'd never fully considered. In all his self-recrimination, he'd focused on his failure to maintain proper altitude and airspeed, but he'd never systematically analyzed why those parameters had been wrong that particular day. I've never thought about it that way, he admitted. Marie recognized the importance of this moment, the possibility that Jack might begin to see his accident as something more complex than simple pilot error. Jack, in your professional opinion, what factors besides pilot judgment can affect the outcome of aerobatic maneuvers? Jack's analytical mind engaged with the question despite his emotional resistance. Weather conditions, aircraft mechanical status, unexpected wind shears, spectator positioning that affects your reference points. He paused, remembering details of that day he'd buried under layers of guilt. Actually, there was an issue with my altimeter that morning. The calibration seemed off, but the mechanics assured me it was within acceptable tolerances. What kind of issue? Marie asked. It was reading about 50 feet higher than my GPS indicated. Not enough to ground the aircraft, but enough to affect precision maneuvering. Jack's voice carried growing realization. If I was flying by the altimeter instead of visual references, I would have started my pull-out 50 feet lower than I intended. Lily nodded as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. So maybe it wasn't all your fault. Maybe your instruments were giving you wrong information. Jack felt something shift in his understanding of that day, not absolution, but a more complete picture that included factors beyond his control. Even if that's true, he said carefully, I should have caught the discrepancy. A good pilot cross-checks all information sources, doesn't rely on a single instrument. But you're human, Lily said with 9-year-old directness. Humans make mistakes sometimes, especially when they're trying to do really hard things that require perfect timing. Marie watched Jack's face as he processed this new perspective on his accident. She could see him wrestling with the possibility that his failure, while real, might not have been entirely the product of poor judgment and dangerous ego. The people who got hurt, Jack said slowly, they probably don't care whether it was equipment failure or pilot error. They just know they ended up in the hospital because of something I did. Maybe, Lily said, but they also know you didn't hurt them on purpose. And maybe they want you to figure out what really went wrong so it doesn't happen to other pilots. Jack looked at the medal again, seeing it with slightly different eyes, not just as evidence of past glory that had been corrupted by failure, but as proof that he'd once been capable of extraordinary precision and artistry. The skills that had earned this recognition hadn't simply vanished. They'd been buried under fear and self-doubt. You know what I think, Lily continued, settling cross-legged on the floor between Jack and Marie. I think maybe you stopped flying, not because you were dangerous, but because you were scared of being dangerous. And those are different things. Marie was struck by her granddaughter's insight. Lily's right, Jack. Fear of causing harm is often what makes someone the safest possible practitioner of a dangerous skill. It's the people who aren't afraid of the consequences who tend to take unnecessary risks. Jack turned the metal over in his hands, feeling its familiar weight, remembering the pride he'd felt when it was placed around his neck by a fellow pilot whose opinion he respected. Even if that's true, he said, how do you overcome that level of fear? How do you trust yourself again when the stakes are so high? Maybe you start small, Lily suggested. Like, you don't go back to performing in air shows right away. You just practice flying safely, like you said before. And you rebuild your airplane super carefully, checking everything twice, making sure it's perfect. And maybe, Marie added, you remember that the fear you're carrying, the awareness of how much damage you could cause, is actually your greatest asset as a pilot. It's what will keep you careful, methodical, focused on safety above all else. Scout, who had been napping in the corner of the room, suddenly lifted his head and padded over to Jack's chair. The dog rested his chin on Jack's knee and looked up at him with brown eyes full of patient encouragement. Jack scratched behind Scout's ears, then looked at the metal one more time before setting it carefully on the bedside table where he could see it from his pillow. You know what's strange? He said, talking about all this, thinking about what really happened that day. It's the first time in 3 years that the accident doesn't feel like the only story that matters about my flying. What do you mean? Lily asked. I mean, Jack said, his voice carrying a warmth that Marie hadn't heard before. Maybe there are other stories worth remembering. Maybe this medal represents 20 years of safe, beautiful flights for every one day when things went wrong. Lily picked up her hot chocolate and settled back to listen, recognizing that Jack was approaching something important. I flew my first aerobatic routine when I was 24 years old, Jack said, his voice taking on the cadence of someone sharing a treasured memory. It was at a small air show in Eastern Oregon, maybe 50 people in the crowd, but I felt like I was performing at the World Championships. I was so nervous I could barely hold the stick steady during takeoff. What happened? Lily asked. I went up there and flew the most cautious, conservative routine imaginable. Nothing fancy, just basic loops and rolls executed exactly by the book. But when I landed and saw the faces of the kids in the crowd, the way their eyes lit up when they realized humans could actually fly like that, I knew I'd found my calling. Marie saw something she'd never witnessed before in Jack's expression. Uncomplicated happiness at the memory of flight. For the first time since she'd known him, he was allowing himself to remember aviation as a source of joy rather than trauma. I flew for 26 years after that first performance, Jack continued. Hundreds of air shows, thousands of flights, probably millions of people who got to see what's possible when humans partner with machines to dance in the sky. And in all that time, until that last day in Spokane, I never put a single person at risk. That's a pretty good safety record, Marie observed. It's a perfect safety record, Lily corrected with characteristic precision. Except for one day, when your instruments were broken and you made a mistake that could have happened to anybody. Jack looked at her with something approaching wonder. You know, Lily, I think you might be right. Maybe the story isn't that I'm a dangerous pilot. You shouldn't be trusted with an aircraft. Maybe the story is that I'm a careful pilot who had one very bad day and learned from it. And maybe, Lily added hopefully, you're ready to have some good days again. The phone call came on a Thursday morning while Jack was in Tom's workshop, carefully cataloging the salvaged parts from his aircraft that Frank Morrison had delivered the day before. He'd been making steady progress on the restoration project, approaching each component with the methodical attention to detail that Marie had come to recognize as his way of rebuilding confidence along with machinery. Jack's cell phone recently repaired and returned to service after the crash rang with the harsh electronic tone that always made him jump slightly. The number was unfamiliar, but something about the area code triggered a recognition he couldn't quite place. "Jack Barnes," he answered, setting down the propeller blade he'd been examining for stress fractures. "Dad?" The voice on the other end was female, tentative, carrying decades of unresolved emotion in a single syllable. Jack felt the workshop spin around him. He hadn't heard his daughter Sarah's voice in over 2 years, not since the last stilted phone conversation that had ended with her hanging up in frustration and him pouring another drink to numb the guilt of being a father who'd forgotten how to talk to his own child. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you find me?" "I've been looking for you for months," she said, and Jack could hear tears threatening at the edges of her words. "I hired a private investigator, checked with all the airports where you might be working, called every flight school in the Pacific Northwest. Finally, someone at Portland International remembered you mentioning Marie Donovan's name after your crash." Jack sank onto Tom's workbench, the carefully organized aircraft parts suddenly seeming insignificant compared to the weight of this unexpected connection to the family he'd abandoned through shame and self-imposed exile. "Sarah, I'm sorry," he began, but she interrupted him. "Dad, I need your help," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "It's Emma. She's sick, really sick, and she's been asking for you." Emma, Jack's granddaughter, the child he'd seen exactly 3 times in her 8 years of life, always at awkward family gatherings where his presence felt more obligatory than welcome. The little girl who had inherited his blue eyes and Sarah's stubborn chin, who had asked him once why he didn't come to visit more often, a question he'd answered with vague promises about being busy that fooled no one. What kind of sick? Jack asked, though he could guess from Sarah's tone that it wasn't the ordinary childhood illness that parents learn to navigate with patience and medicine. "Leukemia," Sarah said, the word carrying the weight of every parent's worst nightmare. "They caught it early, and the doctors say her chances are good, but she's facing months of treatment. Chemotherapy, possible bone marrow transplant if the first round doesn't work." Jack closed his eyes, trying to process information that felt too big for comprehension. His granddaughter, a child he barely knew but had always assumed would have evased. Decades to get to know, was fighting for her life, while he'd been selfishly wallowing in guilt over a career that suddenly seemed trivially unimportant. "How long has she been sick?" he asked. "We got the diagnosis 6 weeks ago," Sarah said. "I wanted to call you sooner, but I didn't know how to reach you. And honestly, I wasn't sure you'd want to be involved." The admission hit Jack harder than any accusation could have. His daughter, his only child, had faced the most frightening experience of parenthood, alone because he'd spent 3 years proving that he was too unreliable, too consumed with his own problems, to be counted on when family needed him. Of course. "I want to be involved," Jack said, though even as he spoke the words, he wondered if they were true. What did he have to offer an 8-year-old fighting cancer? What comfort could he provide when he barely managed to function in his own life? "Emma keeps talking about her grandpa, the pilot," Sarah continued. "She remembers you telling her about flying, about what it feels like to see the world from above the clouds. The doctors say keeping her spirits up is important for treatment. Outcomes, and she's been asking when you're coming to see her fly again." Jack felt something cold settle in his chest. "Sarah, I don't fly anymore. I haven't been in an aircraft since the crash." "I couldn't. I know about Spokane," Sarah interrupted. "I know what happened at that airshow, and I know that's why you disappeared from our lives. But Dad, Emma doesn't care about any of that. She just wants to see her grandfather, and she's been telling everyone at the hospital that you're going to take her flying when she gets better." The workshop around Jack seemed to contract, the walls pressing in with the weight of expectations he couldn't possibly meet. How could he explain to an 8-year-old with cancer that her pilot grandfather had lost his nerve? That the man she remembered telling stories about dancing with clouds was now afraid to leave the ground? "Where are you?" he asked finally. "Seattle. Children's Hospital. We've been here for 3 weeks now, and Emma's scheduled for another round of chemotherapy next week." Sarah's voice carried exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. "Dad, I know we haven't been close these past few years. I know you've been dealing with your own problems. But Anna needs hope right now, and somehow you've become her symbol of everything that's possible when you refuse to give up on your dreams." Jack laughed bitterly. "Sarah, I gave up on my dreams 3 years ago. I'm not the man Emma thinks I am." "Maybe not," Sarah said, "but you could be. If not for yourself, then for her. She's fighting the hardest battle of her life, and all she wants is to know that the people she loves believe beautiful things are still possible." Through the workshop window, Jack could see Marie's backyard, where he and Lily had spent so many afternoons building kites and talking about the principles of flight. He thought about the careful way Lily approached each new project, the absolute faith she had in the possibility of making things fly through patience and proper engineering. "I don't know if I can be what Emma needs," Jack said quietly. "You don't have to be perfect," Sarah said. "You just have to be here." "Can you do that? Can you come to Seattle and be Emma's grandfather for a while?" Jack looked at the aircraft parts spread across Tom's workbench, the restoration project that had been slowly rebuilding his confidence in his own abilities. Marie had been right. The work of bringing broken things back to life was healing something inside him that he'd thought was permanently damaged. But this was different. This was about being present for someone else's crisis instead of hiding from his own. Yes, he heard himself say, "I'll come. I'll be there as soon as I can arrange." Transportation. "Thank you," Sarah said, and Jack could hear tears of relief in her voice. "Dad, there's something else. Emma's been carrying around this old photograph she found in Mom's things after the divorce. It's a picture of you and her from her 3rd birthday, when you took her to that little airfield to watch the planes take off." Jack remembered the day one of the few times he'd been alone with Emma, before the complexity of his failed marriage and demanding career had made family relationships feel like obligations rather than opportunities for joy. "She loves that picture," Sarah continued. "She keeps showing it to the nurses and doctors, telling them about how her grandpa taught her to identify different types of aircraft by the sound of their engines. She says when she gets better, you're going to take her flying so she can see what clouds look like from the inside." The weight of Emma's faith in him was almost unbearable. Jack pulled the photograph from his wallet, the one he'd hidden away, unable to look at without feeling the full force of everything he'd lost through his own poor choices. In it, 3-year-old Emma sat on his shoulders, both of them grinning at the camera while a small plane taxied in the background. Her tiny hands were spread like wings, and his expression held the uncomplicated joy of a grandfather sharing his passions with someone who found them magical. "Sarah," Jack said, "I need you to understand something. I can't promise Emma that I'll take her flying. I'm not sure I'll ever be ready to pilot an aircraft again. But I can promise that I'll be there, and I'll do whatever I can to help her. Believe that dreams are worth fighting for." "That's all I'm asking," Sarah said. "Just be her grandfather. Be the man who taught her that humans can fly if they're brave enough to try." After they arranged the details of his visit, Jack sat in the workshop for a long time, holding the photograph and trying to comprehend how his life had suddenly shifted from the careful, controlled environment he'd built around his guilt to the chaotic, urgent demands of family crisis. Marie found him there an hour later, still staring at the picture of himself and Emma, his face carrying an expression she hadn't seen before, not quite fear, but something closer to overwhelmed determination. "Lily's here for her afternoon kite session," Marie said gently, "but I can tell her you need some time alone if you'd prefer." Jack looked up at her. This woman who had taken him in without question and helped him begin to rebuild his sense of worth through patient work and genuine care. "Marie, I need to go to Seattle. My granddaughter is sick, and my daughter needs me to be present for something I'm not sure I'm equipped to handle." Marie settled into the chair beside Tom's workbench, giving Jack her full attention in the way that had become natural between them. "Tell me what's happened." Jack shared the details of Sarah's call, the news about Emma's leukemia, the impossible expectation that he could somehow provide hope to a child fighting for her life when he'd spent 3 years hiding from the possibility of failure. "And the hardest part," Jack concluded, "is that Emma believes I'm going to take her flying when she recovers. She has this picture of me from before I crashed, before I lost my nerve. And she thinks I'm still the grandfather who can make magical things happen in the sky." Marie studied the photograph he handed her, seeing in it the evidence of who Jack had been before fear and guilt had convinced him he was dangerous. "Maybe," she said carefully, "Emma's belief in you is exactly what you need to become, that grandfather again. But what if I can't? What if I go to Seattle and she sees that I'm not the man she remembers? What if I disappoint a sick child who needs to believe in something beautiful?" Before Marie could answer, Lily appeared in the workshop doorway, her usual afternoon enthusiasm subdued by the serious tone of conversation she'd overheard. "Jack," she said quietly, "are you okay? You look sad." Jack looked at this 9-year-old girl who had spent weeks teaching him to find joy in simple flight, who had helped him remember that aviation could be about wonder rather than performance. In many ways, Lily had already shown him how to be the kind of adult who could nurture a child's dreams without overwhelming them with adult anxieties. "Lily," he said, "how would you feel about helping me with a very important project? I need to figure out how to bring hope to someone who's facing a really difficult challenge." Lily's eyes lit up with the seriousness she brought to problems that mattered. "What kind of hope does she need?" "She needs to believe," Jack said, surprising himself with the clarity of his answer, "that people who love flying can overcome being afraid to fly. She needs to know that dreams don't die just because they get interrupted by difficult circumstances." Lily considered this for a moment, then walked to the workbench where Jack's restoration project was carefully laid out. "Maybe," she said, touching the propeller blade he'd been examining, "she needs to see that broken things can be fixed, and that sometimes they're even stronger afterward." Marie watched Jack's face transform as he realized what Lily was suggesting. Not that he needed to arrive in Seattle as a fully healed pilot ready to take Emma flying, but that he could share with her the process of healing, the slow work of rebuilding something that had been damaged but not destroyed. "You think Emma would be interested in aircraft restoration?" Jack asked. "I think," Lily said with the wisdom that sometimes emerges from childhood, "she'd be very interested in the story of how her grandpa learned to fly again." Jack's hands trembled as he opened his pilot logbook for the first time in 3 years, the leather-bound record of his flying life, feeling heavier than it should. Every flight he'd ever made was documented in these pages, from his first solo flight as a 17-year-old to that final, disastrous performance in Spokane. 29 years of aviation history, reduced to careful entries in black ink that recorded altitudes, weather conditions, aircraft types, and the gradual evolution from nervous student pilot to confident aerobatic performer. Marie sat beside him at her kitchen table, offering silent support as he prepared for what might be the most difficult journey he'd made since learning to fly. In 12 hours, he would drive to Seattle to see Emma, carrying with him not just his own anxiety about being the grandfather she needed, but a carefully constructed plan that Lily had helped him develop for sharing hope through the patient. Work of restoration. "Look at this entry," Jack said, pointing to a page dated nearly 3 decades earlier. "My first aerobatic lesson. I was so scared I threw up twice before takeoff, but I was also more excited than I'd ever been in my life. Marie examined his careful handwriting, noting how even his earliest entries reflected the methodical attention to detail that had made him a successful pilot. What made you want to learn aerobatic flying? Most people are content with straight and level flight. Jack smiled at the memory, his first genuine expression of warmth. Sarah's phone call the day before. I saw an airshow when I was 16, just a small regional event, but there was this pilot who flew a routine that looked like aerial ballet. Every maneuver flowed into the next one, and the whole sequence told a story about freedom, about what's possible when humans stop being earthbound. He flipped through pages, documenting years of training, practice sessions, first performances, gradually increasing complexity and responsibility. Each entry represented hours of preparation, study, physical conditioning, the unglamorous work that made spectacular flight possible. "Here's my first airshow performance," Jack said, stopping at an entry that recorded a simple routine at a county fair in Eastern Oregon. I was 24, flying a borrowed aircraft, so nervous I could barely hold the control stick steady. But when I landed and saw the faces of the kids in the crowd, He paused, remembering the pure joy of that moment. I knew I'd found my calling. Marie watched him turn the pages, noting how his entries became more confident over the years, documenting increasingly complex routines, larger crowds, more prestigious venues. This was a record of mastery achieved through dedication and patience, exactly the kind of story that might inspire a sick child to believe in the possibility of overcoming difficult challenges. "Jack," she said gently, "Emma doesn't need to see a perfect grandfather who never makes mistakes. She needs to see someone who understands that worthwhile things require patience and practice. Someone who knows that setbacks don't mean giving up on dreams." Jack nodded, but his anxiety remained visible in the tension around his eyes. "I just keep thinking about what Sarah said, that Emma believes I'm going to take her flying when she recovers. How do I tell an 8-year-old with leukemia that her pilot grandfather is afraid of airplanes?" Before Marie could respond, Scout trotted into the kitchen carrying something in his mouth, a paper airplane that Lily must have left behind during her last visit. The golden retriever sat beside Jack's chair and gently placed the folded paper on the table, as if offering his own solution to the problem at hand. Jack picked up the paper airplane, smoothing out the creases where Scout's careful grip had compressed the wings. It was one of Lily's more sophisticated designs, with adjustments for stability and distance that reflected everything she'd learned about aerodynamics during their weeks of kite-building sessions. "Maybe," Marie suggested, "you start where you and Lily started, with something simple and safe, something that can't hurt anyone even if it doesn't work perfectly." The front door opened, and Lily's voice carried through the house as she announced her arrival for what had become their regular afternoon flying session. She appeared in the kitchen moments later, taking in the scene of Jack's open logbook, Marie's supportive presence, and Scout's offering of paper aircraft. "Are you getting ready to see Emma?" Lily asked with the directness that always caught adults off guard. Jack had told her about Sarah's call and his planned trip to Seattle, but he was surprised by how quickly she'd grasped the emotional complexity of the situation. "I'm trying to figure out how to be the grandfather she needs," he said. Lily examined the paper airplane Scout had retrieved, testing its balance and checking the alignment of its wings. "Jack, remember what you told me about teaching people to fly? You said you always start with ground school learning the theory before you try the practical stuff." "That's true for adult students," Jack said. "But Emma's 8 years old and fighting a serious illness. I'm not sure she has patience for theoretical discussions about aerodynamics." "Not aerodynamics," Lily clarified. "Hope, you could teach her about hope by showing her your logbook, telling her stories about all the times you learned new things and got better at flying. You could show her that becoming good at something takes time, and that everyone makes mistakes while they're Learning. Marie recognized the wisdom in Lily's suggestion. You could share the process with her, Jack. Let her see that you're working on flying again, that it's something you do step by step, carefully and patiently. Jack looked at the logbook spread before him, seeing it not as a record of past achievements, corrupted by ultimate failure, but as evidence of a lifetime spent learning, growing, overcoming challenges through persistent effort. I've been thinking about something else, he said slowly. Frank Morrison offered to help me transport some of the smaller restoration parts to Seattle if I wanted to continue working on the project while I'm visiting Emma. Maybe she'd be interested in learning about aircraft mechanics while I'm learning to trust myself again. Lily's face lit up with excitement. That's perfect. You can work on rebuilding your airplane while she's getting better. And she could see that fixing broken things is possible, even when it takes a long time. Marie felt her heart swell with pride for both Jack and her granddaughter. Over the past weeks, she'd watched them teach each other about resilience, patience, and the quiet courage required to pursue dreams that seemed impossible. Now, they were applying those lessons to the most important challenge any of them had faced. There's something I want to give you for the trip, Marie said, rising from the table and disappearing into her bedroom. She returned carrying a small wooden box that Jack recognized as the one containing her nursing certificate and professional commendations. Marie, I can't take your... Not the contents, Marie interrupted, opening the box to reveal something new nestled beside her carefully preserved documents. It was a hand-carved wooden airplane, unmistakably the work of Tom's skilled hands, painted in bright primary colors that would appeal to a child's imagination. Tom made this for Lily when she first started talking about becoming a pilot, Marie explained. But I think Emma needs it more right now. It's something tangible to hold on to, a reminder that people who love her are working on making flight possible. Jack accepted the wooden toy with reverence appropriate to a sacred object. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Every detail of the small aircraft had been carved with the patience and love that Tom brought to all his woodworking projects. It's beautiful, Jack said quietly. But are you sure Lily won't mind giving this up? Lily shook her head emphatically. Emma needs it more than I do. Besides, I have all our kites and everything you've taught me about flying. She just has hopes right now, and hopes need something real to hold on to. Marie watched Jack carefully wrap the wooden airplane in tissue paper, adding it to the collection of items he was preparing for his journey to Seattle. The logbook, the restoration photos he'd been documenting, Frank Morrison's written assessment of the aircraft's rebuildability, and now Tom's wooden plane tangible, evidence that dreams could survive interruption and that patient work could restore what seemed permanently broken. Jack, Marie said, as he prepared to close his travel bag, do you remember what you told me about why you became a flight instructor before you started performing aerobatics professionally? Jack paused in his packing. I said teaching other people to fly helped me understand my own flying better. That sharing knowledge made me a more complete pilot. Maybe, Marie suggested, helping Emma believe in the possibility of flight, even while you're working on believing in it yourself, will help you both heal in ways you can't accomplish alone. Scout, apparently satisfied that his contribution to the evening's preparations had been acknowledged, settled at Jack's feet with the patient devotion that had characterized his relationship with their houseguest since that first stormy night. The dog's presence seemed to calm Jack's visible anxiety, reminding him that loyalty and trust could exist without guarantees of perfect outcomes. Lily picked up one of her paper airplanes from the kitchen counter, a sleek fighter jet design that had performed particularly well in their recent test flights. She carefully wrote something on one of the wings in her neat 9-year-old handwriting, then handed it to Jack. For Emma, she said, so she knows that kids who dream about flying are thinking about her. Jack unfolded the wing to read Lily's message. Dear Emma, flying is about being brave enough to try, patient enough to practice, and happy enough to share the sky with people you love. Your friend, Lily. He looked at this 9-year-old girl who had helped him rediscover his own courage through the simple act of believing in his worth, who had taught him that healing happened through small steps rather than dramatic gestures. Lily, he said, what should I tell Emma about the difference between being afraid and being careful? Lily considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all aviation matters. Tell her that being careful means you pay attention to important things like wind conditions and making sure your airplane is working properly. But being afraid means you don't try at all, even when you know how to be safe. And how do you know when you're ready to move from being afraid to being careful? When you have people who love you enough to help you remember what you're good at, Lily said simply. Like how Grandma Marie and I helped you remember that you know how to make things fly safely. Marie felt tears threaten as she watched Jack absorb the wisdom of her granddaughter's words. This child, who had never flown in anything more sophisticated than a commercial airliner, understood something fundamental about courage that many adults struggled to grasp. That bravery wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act. With love despite uncertainty about outcomes, Jack closed his travel bag and lifted it from the table, testing its weight. Along with his clothes and toiletries, he carried tools for continuing his restoration work, his complete flying history, photographic evidence of his healing progress, and tokens of faith from people who had learned to believe in his worth even when he couldn't. I'll call you when I get to Seattle, Jack said, embracing Marie with the gratitude of someone whose life had been saved by unexpected kindness. And I'll send pictures of Emma working on aircraft restoration, assuming she's interested in learning about it. She'll be interested, Lily said confidently. Anyone who dreams about flying wants to understand how it works. Jack knelt to Scout's level, accepting the dog's enthusiastic goodbye and scratching behind the ears that had first heard his heartbeat on that stormy night when rescue took the form of golden fur and absolute loyalty. Thank you, he said to Scout, who responded by placing one paw on Jack's knee in the gesture of comfort that had become their private language. As Jack loaded his car in Marie's driveway, the early evening light casting long shadows across the lake, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Not confidence, exactly, but something approaching hope. He was driving toward uncertainty, toward the possibility of disappointing a sick child who needed him to be stronger than he felt. But he was also carrying with him the accumulated wisdom of weeks spent learning that healing happened through patient work shared with people who believed in second chances. The wooden airplane Tom had carved sat carefully protected in his passenger seat, along with Lily's paper aircraft and its message of encouragement. In his rearview mirror, he could see Marie and Lily standing on the porch with Scout, 3 beings who had taught him that rescue often looked different than expected, quieter, more gradual, built on daily acts of faith rather than dramatic interventions. Jack started the car and began the drive toward Seattle, toward his granddaughter, toward the possibility that sharing hope might be another form of flight, one that didn't require leaving the ground, but still offered the chance to soar. The decision came to Jack at 3:47 in the morning on his 3rd day in Seattle, as he sat beside Emma's hospital bed, watching his granddaughter sleep. The chemotherapy had left her small frame even smaller, her skin pale against the bright hospital gown, decorated with cartoon airplanes that Sarah had bought to make the sterile room feel more cheerful. But Emma's breathing was steady, and the doctors had been cautiously optimistic about her response to treatment. On the bedside table, Lily's paper airplane sat carefully positioned so Emma could see it when she woke, its wing bearing the message about courage and shared skies that had become Emma's touchstone during the difficult nights when pain made sleep elusive. Beside it lay Tom's wooden airplane, worn smooth now from Emma's constant handling, and Jack's restoration photos spread out like a promise of things being rebuilt. Jack pulled his phone from his pocket and scrolled to Marie's number, knowing she would be awake despite the early hour. Insomnia had been her companion since Tom's death, and he suspected she'd been keeping vigil from 300 miles away, waiting for news of Emma's progress and his own emotional survival. Jack? Marie's voice came through immediately, alert and concerned. "She's sleeping peacefully," Jack said quietly, stepping into the hallway to avoid waking Emma. "The doctors say the treatment is working. Her white cell count is improving, and she's been strong enough to work on aircraft restoration with me every afternoon. How are you holding up?" Jack leaned against the hospital wall, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows that reminded him of the difference between the sterile environment and the warm, natural light of Marie's lakeside home. "Marie, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Always. Do you think I'm ready to fly again? Not aerobatics, not performing, just basic flight. Taking an aircraft up safely and bringing it down in one piece." Marie was quiet for a moment, and Jack could picture her considering the question with the careful attention she brought to all matters of genuine importance. "What makes you ask that now?" "Anna," Jack said simply. "Yesterday she asked me when we were going to fly together, and I started giving her the same careful non-answers I've been using for 3 years. But she looked at me with those blue eyes that are exactly like mine were at her age, and she said something that stopped me cold." "What did she say?" "She said, 'Grandpa, I know you're scared about flying because you made a mistake once. But I'm scared about getting sicker, and I still have to keep trying to get better. Maybe we could be brave together.'" Marie's intake of breath was audible through the phone. 8-year-old wisdom. "She's been working beside me every day, learning about aircraft systems, understanding how each part of the restoration makes the plane safer and more reliable. She knows more about my Cessna now than most adult passengers know about commercial aircraft." Jack paused, watching a nurse walk quietly past Emma's room. "Marie, she trusts me completely. She believes I can take her flying safely because she's watched me rebuild every component with absolute attention to detail. Do you trust yourself?" Jack considered the question that had haunted him for 3 years. With Emma's life? With the responsibility of piloting an aircraft that carries someone I love more than my own safety? He was quiet for a moment. "Yes, I think I do." "Then you have your answer. But what if I'm wrong? What if I'm confusing hope with readiness, optimism with competence?" Marie's voice carried the gentle authority she'd developed through decades of helping people make decisions that balanced risk with healing. "Jack, you've spent 3 months rebuilding not just an aircraft, but your understanding of what went wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. You've approached this restoration with more care and documentation than most professionals bring to their work. If you can't trust yourself after that level of preparation, then fear has won. Permanently." Jack looked through the window of Emma's room, where his granddaughter slept surrounded by the evidence of their shared work, technical drawings, photographs of restored components, his logbook open to pages that documented his complete flying history. "There's something else," Jack said. "Frank Morrison called yesterday. The restoration is essentially complete. We've rebuilt or replaced every system that was damaged in the crash, and everything has been inspected and certified by a licensed mechanic. The aircraft is legally and mechanically ready to fly. But you're not sure you are. I'm not sure how to make that final step from rebuilding an aircraft to actually piloting it. The gap between mechanical readiness and emotional courage feels enormous." Marie was quiet for a moment, and Jack could sense her thinking through the complexity of his situation. "Jack, what did you tell Emma when she asked about being brave together?" "I told her I'd think about it. And what have you thought?" Jack looked at his reflection in the hospital window, seeing a man who had spent 3 years running from the possibility of failure, but who had somehow found himself in a place where love mattered more than fear. I've thought that maybe the way to overcome being afraid of flying isn't to stop being afraid. Maybe it's to find something more important than the fear. He paused. Emma wants to see the world from above the clouds. She wants to understand what I meant when I told her that flying feels like dancing with the wind, and she's running out of time for childhood dreams. What do you mean? The doctors say she needs at least 6 more months of treatment, maybe longer. By the time she's completely well, she'll be 9, almost 10. Still young enough for wonder, but getting close to the age where magic starts feeling childish. Jack's voice carried the weight of understanding how quickly innocence could be lost. If I'm going to take her flying, it needs to be soon, while she still believes that pilots can make impossible things happen. Marie recognized the moment of choice Jack was facing, not just whether to fly again, but whether to trust that love could overcome the paralysis of perfect caution. "Where would you take her?" Marie asked. "I've been thinking about that," Jack said, his voice gaining strength as he worked through logistics that had been forming in his mind throughout his sleepless night. "There's a small airfield about 20 minutes from the hospital Renton Municipal. It's controlled airspace, good facilities, and they rent aircraft to qualified pilots. I could take Emma up for maybe 30 minutes, show her the Puget Sound. From the air, let her see Seattle spread out below us like a map come to life." "That sounds perfect. But Marie, what if something goes wrong? What if I freeze up or make an error in judgment? Or—" "Jack," Marie interrupted gently, "what if everything goes right? What if you give Emma an experience that sustains her through months of treatment? What if you rediscover that flying can be about joy instead of fear? What if you learn that healing sometimes requires accepting reasonable risks instead of perfect safety?" Jack looked again at Emma's sleeping form, so small and fragile but radiating the kind of fierce determination that had carried her through weeks of chemotherapy without losing her essential optimism. "I need to call the flight school at Renton," Jack said, decision crystallizing in his voice. "Check their aircraft availability. Make sure my certifications are current. Arrange for a pre-flight refresher with an instructor. Are you going to tell Emma what you're planning?" Jack smiled. "For the first time in days. I'm going to ask her if she'd like to help me plan a flight. She's become quite the aviation expert. I think she deserves to be part of the decision-making process." After ending the call with Marie, Jack returned to Emma's bedside and settled into the chair that had become his temporary home. His granddaughter stirred slightly, her hand reaching unconsciously for Tom's wooden airplane, and Jack felt the familiar tug of protective love that had been growing stronger each day of his visit. In a few hours, Emma would wake up and ask, as she did every morning, whether today might be the day they could go flying together. And for the first time in 3 years, Jack would have an answer that didn't involve careful deflection or promises about some indefinite future. He pulled Lily's paper airplane from the bedside table and unfolded it carefully, rereading the message that had become both his granddaughter's inspiration and his own reminder of what courage actually meant. "Flying is about being brave enough to try, patient enough to practice, and happy enough to share the sky with people you love." Jack refolded the paper airplane and placed it back where Emma could see it immediately upon waking. Tomorrow, if the weather was good and Emma felt strong enough, they would discover together whether a grounded pilot could learn to soar again, not for crowds or recognition, but for the pure joy of sharing flight with someone whose dreams were too beautiful to remain earthbound. Emma's hospital bracelet caught the morning sunlight as she pressed her face against the passenger window of Jack's rental car, watching Renton Municipal Airport grow larger as they approached the small facility that would either restore or permanently end his flying career. The bracelet bore her name, birth date, and medical information in stark black lettering, lettering, Reminder of the fragility that made this shared adventure both precious and terrifying. "Are you nervous, Grandpa?" Emma asked, her voice carrying the kind of excited anticipation that belongs uniquely to childhood, unmarked by the adult understanding of how many things could go wrong. Jack considered lying, offering the kind of confident reassurance adults typically provide to children before potentially dangerous activities. Instead, he chose honesty. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm more nervous than I've been about anything in years. But good nervous or bad nervous?" Jack smiled at the distinction she'd learned to make during her weeks of medical treatments. The difference between fear that paralyzed and fear that energized, between anxiety that warned of genuine danger and excitement that signaled approaching joy. "Good nervous," he said, realizing as he spoke that it was true. The kind of nervous that means something important is about to happen. They parked outside the flight school office, where Jack had spent the previous afternoon completing paperwork, taking a written exam to refresh his knowledge of current regulations, and flying with an instructor who had pronounced him not just competent, but impressively careful in his approach to every aspect of aircraft operation. Emma climbed out of the car, carrying Tom's wooden airplane and Lily's paper aircraft, treasures that had accompanied her to every chemotherapy session and doctor's appointment. Today, they would serve as talismans for an adventure that represented the culmination of everything she'd learned about the possibility of flight. "Mr. Barnes," called a voice from the flight school entrance. Jack turned to see his instructor from the previous day, Janet Morrison, Frank's daughter, who had inherited her father's aviation expertise, along with his practical approach to assessing pilot readiness. Emma's hospital bracelet caught the morning sunlight as she pressed her face against the passenger window of Jack's rental car, watching Renton Municipal Airport grow larger as they approached the small facility that would either restore or permanently end his flying career. The bracelet bore her name, birth date, and medical information in stark black lettering, reminder of the fragility that made this shared adventure both precious and terrifying. "Are you nervous, Grandpa?" Emma asked, her voice carrying the kind of excited anticipation that belongs uniquely to childhood, unmarked by the adult understanding of how many things could go wrong. Jack considered lying, offering the kind of confident reassurance adults typically provide to children before potentially dangerous activities. Instead, he chose honesty. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm more nervous than I've been about anything in years. But good nervous or bad nervous?" Jack smiled at the distinction she'd learned to make during her weeks of medical treatments. The difference between fear that paralyzed and fear that energized, between anxiety that warned of genuine danger and excitement that signaled approaching joy. "Good nervous," he said, realizing as he spoke that it was true. The kind of nervous that means something important is about to happen. They parked outside the flight school office, where Jack had spent the previous afternoon completing paperwork, taking a written exam to refresh his knowledge of current regulations, and flying with an instructor who had pronounced him not just competent, but impressively careful in his approach to every aspect of aircraft operation. Emma climbed out of the car carrying Tom's wooden airplane and Lily's paper aircraft, treasures that had accompanied her to every chemotherapy session and doctor's appointment. Today, they would serve as talismans for an adventure that represented the culmination of everything she'd learned about the possibility of flight. "Mr. Barnes," called a voice from the flight school entrance. Jack turned to see his instructor from the previous day, Janet Morrison, Frank's daughter, who had inherited her father's aviation expertise, along with his practical approach to assessing pilot readiness. "This must be Emma," Janet said, crouching to meet Jack's granddaughter at eye level. "Your grandfather tells me you become quite the aircraft restoration expert." Emma nodded proudly, holding up Tom's wooden airplane. "We rebuilt his whole plane together. Every single part got checked twice to make sure it was safe." "That's exactly the right approach," Janet said with genuine admiration. The best pilots are the ones who never take shortcuts when it comes to safety. She stood and addressed Jack. The aircraft is fueled and ready for your pre-flight inspection. Take all the time you need. Rushing is the enemy of good judgment. Jack felt his hands tremble slightly as he took the clipboard containing the rental agreement and flight plan. After 3 years of avoiding this moment, he was about to trust himself with an aircraft again. With Emma's life depending on his ability to make sound decisions under pressure, they walked across the tarmac toward a pristine Cessna 172, its white paint gleaming in the morning sun. Emma stayed close beside him, her excitement palpable as she examined the aircraft with the knowledgeable eye of someone who understood every system they'd studied together during the restoration process. "It looks just like the pictures in your logbook," Emma observed, running her small hand along the wing's leading edge with the reverence of touching something magical. Jack began his pre-flight inspection with methodical precision, checking every component with the kind of attention to detail that had characterized his approach to the restoration project. Emma followed along, asking informed questions about control surface movement, fuel quantity, engine oil levels, demonstrating an understanding of aircraft systems that impressed even Janet, who had seen many young people develop interest in aviation, but few with such genuine comprehension. "Grandpa," Emma said as Jack completed his examination of the propeller, "remember what you taught me about trusting the airplane to do what it's designed to do?" Jack looked at her, struck by how his own words sounded when reflected back by someone who believed in them completely. "I remember. I think maybe you should trust yourself the same way. You know how to fly safely. You've just been scared to try." The simplicity of her observation cut through 3 years of psychological complexity with the kind of clarity that only children could provide. Jack had spent countless hours studying, practicing, analyzing what had gone wrong in Spokane. But Emma understood something more fundamental, that knowledge without action remained incomplete. That healing required the courage to test whether restoration had actually worked. "You're right," Jack said, helping her into the passenger seat and adjusting her seatbelt with the careful attention of someone who understood that this moment represented far more than a simple airplane ride. "Are you ready to see what the world looks like from up there?" Emma nodded enthusiastically, clutching her wooden airplane as Jack settled into the pilot's seat for the first time in 3 years. The familiar layout of instruments and controls welcomed him like an old friend. Everything exactly where muscle memory expected it to be. Waiting patiently for his return, Jack completed his final checks, contacted the control tower for takeoff, clearance, and slowly taxied toward the active runway. With each movement of the aircraft, he felt years of accumulated fear beginning to dissolve, replaced by the focused calm that had always characterized his best flying. "Renton Tower, Cessna 739 Delta ready for departure," he said into the radio microphone, his voice steady with newfound confidence. "Cessna 739 Delta, cleared for takeoff runway 16. Fly heading 270, maintain pattern altitude." Jack aligned the aircraft with the runway centerline, added power gradually, and felt the Cessna accelerate down the asphalt with eager responsiveness. Beside him, Emma watched the instruments with fascination, seeing airspeed increase and engine parameters stabilize exactly as Jack had taught her they would during properly executed takeoff procedures. At rotation speed, Jack pulled gently back on the yoke, and the aircraft lifted gracefully into the morning sky. Emma pressed her face to the window as the ground fell away below them, her gasp of wonder audible even over the engine noise. "Grandpa, look! The cars look like toys, and the houses look like the models you showed me in your restoration books." Jack found himself laughing with pure joy, the first time he'd experienced uncomplicated happiness in an aircraft since before his accident. This was what he'd forgotten during 3 years of self-imposed exile, that flying, at its essence, was about sharing wonder with people you loved, about offering them perspectives that couldn't be achieved any other way. He banked the aircraft gently toward Puget Sound, where morning sunlight painted the water in shades of silver and gold. Below them, Seattle spread out like a living map, its familiar landmarks transformed by altitude into elements of a vast, beautiful pattern that stretched from the mountains to the sea. "Is this what you meant when you said flying feels like dancing? With the wind?" Emma asked, her voice filled with awe as she watched clouds drift past their window. "This is exactly what I meant," Jack said, realizing that he was rediscovering the poetry of flight through her eyes, remembering why he'd fallen in love with aviation before performance and pressure had complicated his relationship with the sky. They flew for 20 minutes over the Sound, with Emma asking questions about navigation, weather patterns, the physics that kept them aloft. Jack answered each inquiry with the patience of someone who understood that sharing knowledge was its own form of gift, that teaching someone to understand flight was almost as beautiful as flying itself. As they returned toward Renton for landing, Emma grew quiet, watching the airport grow larger through the windscreen. "Grandpa," she said finally, "thank you for being brave enough to fly with me. This is the best day I've had since I got sick." Jack felt tears threaten as he realized what this flight had accomplished, not just for Emma, who had experienced the magic of seeing the world from above, but for himself. He had rediscovered that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act with love despite uncertainty about outcomes. "Emma," he said as he configured the aircraft for landing, "you helped me remember something I'd forgotten. Flying isn't about being perfect. It's about being careful, prepared, and present for the people who trust you with their dreams." The landing was smooth, professional, executed with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory supported by renewed confidence. As they taxied back to the flight school, Jack realized that something fundamental had shifted in his relationship with aviation. The fear that had grounded him for 3 years hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into the kind of respectful caution that made him a better, safer pilot. Emma unbuckled her seatbelt and turned to face him, her blue eyes bright with the kind of joy that comes from experiencing something genuinely magical. "Can we go flying again sometime? Maybe when I'm all better?" "Yes," Jack said without hesitation. "When you're well again, we'll plan a longer flight. Maybe to visit Marie and Lily, so you can meet the people who helped me remember how to be brave." As they walked back toward the flight school office, Emma clutching her wooden airplane and chattering excitedly about everything she'd seen from their aerial perspective, Jack felt the weight of 3 years' worth of self-doubt finally lifting from his shoulders. He had taken an aircraft up safely and brought it down in one piece, but more importantly, he had given his granddaughter an experience that would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead. The phone in his pocket buzzed with a text message from Marie. "How did it go?" Jack looked at Emma, who was already planning their next aviation adventure, and typed back, "We're both flying again." 6 months later, Jack stood in the doorway of what had once been Tom's workshop, now transformed into something that honored both its original purpose and its current function as the headquarters of Cedar Lake Flight Instruction. The space hummed with purposeful activity, his fully restored Cessna's engine components arranged on one workbench while Lily and 2 other students worked on an advanced kite project at another table. Their careful measurements and precise construction techniques reflecting everything they'd learned about the principles of flight. Marie looked up from her desk in the corner where she managed the flight school's administrative duties, her nursing certificate now joined by her recently earned aircraft dispatcher certification. At 66, she had discovered that retirement didn't mean the end of meaningful work. It meant the beginning of work chosen for love rather than necessity. "Jack," she called. "Emma's on the phone. She wants to know if you think she's ready for her first solo flight in the kite she built." Jack smiled as he accepted the phone, marveling at how naturally the conversation with his granddaughter flowed. Now, Emma's cancer had been declared in remission 3 months earlier, and she'd spent the summer dividing her time between recovery and increasingly sophisticated aviation projects that she pursued with the methodical enthusiasm of someone who understood that dreams required both patience and practice. Grandpa Jack. Emma's voice carried the excitement of an 11-year-old who had learned that surviving difficult challenges only made beautiful experiences more precious. The doctors say I'm strong enough to visit you next month, and I've been working on a box kite that I think could carry a small camera. Want to see if we can get pictures from higher up than we've ever flown before? I think that sounds like an excellent project, Jack said, looking across the workshop where evidence of their shared aviation education covered every surface. But remember what we learned about testing new designs. Start small, check everything twice, and never rush when safety matters. Emma recited with the precision of someone who had internalized these principles through months of careful instruction. Exactly right. You've become quite the engineer, Emma. I had a good teacher, she said, and Jack could hear the smile in her voice. Grandpa, are you still planning to get your aerobatic certification renewed? Jack glanced at the stack of study materials on his desk: regulatory manuals, performance specifications, safety protocols for the advanced flying he'd once thought was permanently beyond his reach. I'm working on it. Slowly and carefully, the way we learn to rebuild aircraft. Good, Emma said with characteristic determination. Because when I'm old enough to be your co-pilot, I want to learn how to make the airplane dance in the sky, like you used to do. After ending the call, Jack returned to his current project, preparing lesson plans for the next day's ground school session with 3 adult students who had enrolled in his flight instruction program. Word had spread through the aviation community about the grounded aerobatic performer who had returned to flying with a teaching philosophy that emphasized safety, patience, and the joy of shared discovery over the pursuit of impressive achievements. Lily appeared at his elbow, carrying a photograph that Frank Morrison had taken during their latest kite testing session. It showed her managing the controls of their largest creation, a crow lifting kite with nearly 30 square feet of surface area that had successfully carried a small weather monitoring package to an altitude of over 200 feet. Jack, look how high we got the instruments, she said proudly. The data logger recorded wind speeds and temperature changes that we can use to plan even better flights. At 12 years old, Lily had developed into the kind of young aviator that Jack's father would have admired, someone who approached flight with scientific curiosity balanced by profound respect for the forces involved. She'd been accepted into a summer aviation program for exceptional students, and Jack suspected she would be flying solo aircraft before her 16th birthday. Lily, Jack said, examining the photograph that captured not just their technical achievement, but the pure joy on her face as she managed their creation's flight. Do you remember what you told me about the difference between being afraid and being careful? That being careful means paying attention to important things, but being afraid means not trying at all, she recited. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, Jack said, about how you and Emma helped me understand that the fear I was carrying, the awareness of how much responsibility comes with flight, wasn't actually my enemy. It was what made me careful enough to be trusted with other people's safety again. Marie looked up from her desk where she was scheduling aircraft maintenance appointments with the methodical attention that had made her an exceptional nurse and now made her an invaluable partner in their small aviation business. Jack, she sighed. Janet Morrison called this morning. She wanted to know if you'd be interested in providing aerobatic instruction at the regional airshow next summer. Apparently, there's growing demand for teachers who emphasize safety over spectacle. Jack felt the familiar flutter of performance anxiety, but it was tempered now by 3 months of successful flight instruction and the deep satisfaction that came from sharing aviation knowledge with people who approached it with appropriate seriousness. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you'd consider it," Marie said, with the gentle smile that had become his anchor during moments when old fears threatened to resurface. "But only if you felt ready to trust yourself with that level of responsibility." Scout, now gray-muzzled but still devoted to his role as official workshop supervisor, padded over to Jack's chair and rested his chin on his knee. The golden retriever had aged gracefully during the months of rebuilding that had transformed not just Jack's aircraft, but his entire approach to living with purpose rather than merely existing with caution. "What do you think, Scout?" Jack asked, scratching behind the ears that had first heard his heartbeat during that storm-torn night when rescue had taken an unexpected form. "Am I ready to teach other people to dance in the sky?" Scout's tail wagged with the kind of enthusiastic approval that had characterized all his assessments of Jack's progress toward healing. Jack looked around the workshop that had become a place where dreams were restored rather than abandoned, where 3 generations had learned that broken things could be made not just functional but beautiful again. Through the windows, he could see Cedar Lake reflecting the afternoon sky, its surface occasionally marked by the shadow of aircraft, practicing approaches to the small grass airstrip that had become an unofficial extension of their flight instruction program. "Marie," he said, decision crystallizing in his voice, "call Janet back. Tell her I'm interested in the aerobatic instruction program. But I want to make sure she understands my approach. I don't teach people to fly dangerously close to disaster. I teach them to fly beautifully, safely, with respect for the aircraft and responsibility for everyone who might be affected by their choices." "That's exactly the kind of instruction the aviation community needs," Marie said, making notes on her calendar. "And Jack? I think Tom would be very proud of what you've built here." This workshop was always meant to be a place where people learned to create beautiful things that worked properly. Lily looked up from her kite project, string and fabric temporarily, forgotten as she processed the adult conversation happening around her. "Jack, if you start teaching aerobatic flying again, does that mean you've stopped being afraid of making mistakes?" Jack considered her question with the honesty that had become natural in his relationships with the people who had helped him heal. "No, Lily, I don't think the fear ever completely goes away. But I've learned that being afraid of making mistakes isn't the same as being paralyzed by that fear. Good pilots, good people, really use their awareness of risk to make them more careful, not to stop them from living. Like how Grandma Marie went back to nursing, even though she was worried about not being perfect anymore." "Exactly like that," Marie confirmed, looking at her granddaughter with pride for understanding something that many adults struggled to grasp. "Sometimes the most important work we do is the work we're afraid we might not do perfectly." As evening light began to slant through the workshop windows, painting their aviation laboratory in shades of gold that reminded Jack of flight at sunset, he felt the profound gratitude that had become his constant companion. Scout had found him broken beside a crashed aircraft, but the rescue had extended far beyond that first night. It had become a months-long process of learning that healing happened through patient work, shared with people who believed in second chances. The restored Cessna sat outside under a simple hangar that Frank Morrison had helped them construct, ready for tomorrow's flying lessons with students who trusted Jack to teach them not just the mechanics of flight, but its deeper meanings. Emma's next visit was marked on Marie's calendar, along with plans for increasingly ambitious projects that would challenge her recovering strength and expanding knowledge. Lily's aviation scholarship applications were nearly complete, supported by letters of recommendation from instructors who had been impressed by her combination of technical competence and mature judgment. "Jack," Marie said as they prepared to close the workshop for the day, "do you ever think about what would have happened if Scout hadn't found you that night?" Jack looked at the golden retriever, who had somehow known that rescue required not just discovery, but patient, persistent love. "I think," He said that some stories are meant to unfold exactly as they do. Scout found me when I needed finding. You took me in when I needed shelter. Lily taught me to remember joy. And Emma showed me that courage is about acting with love despite fear. He paused, watching the lake reflect the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Maybe that's what flight has always been about, not conquering gravity or impressing crowds, but learning to trust that beautiful things are possible when you're versing, willing to be lifted by forces bigger than your own fear. As they walked toward the house where Marie would prepare dinner for their extended family of choice, Scout trotting contentedly beside them, Jack felt the kind of peace that comes from understanding that some rescues take time to complete, that healing happens through daily acts of faith, and that the most important flights are often the ones that carry other people's dreams along with your own. The wooden airplane Tom had carved for Emma sat on the kitchen windowsill, joined now by a small fleet of models representing aircraft that Jack's students were learning to fly. Lily's paper airplane collection had expanded to include designs from around the world, each one carefully researched and constructed to demonstrate different principles of aerodynamic engineering. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, new opportunities to share the kind of aviation education that emphasized safety and wonder over risk and spectacle. But tonight, they were simply a family bound together by shared understanding that the most beautiful rescues happen slowly, patiently, through the accumulated power of people who refuse to let each other remain grounded by fear. Scout settled beside Jack's chair during dinner, his presence a reminder that loyalty and love could survive any storm, that broken things could be restored to flight, and that sometimes the most important journeys began with a faithful friend leading you through the darkness toward unexpected light.